Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Girmitiya Conference 2021. For all of you who joined us yesterday, welcome back. And for those who are joining us today, I hope you have a good session today. We have a bunch of sessions planned for you. We have 8 sessions in total that are covering multiple themes. Today's session will start off with the burden of history. We have 3 great speakers lined up. The first is Dr. Kamala Lakshmi Nika. The second is Dr. Nalani Moodle, and the third is Mrs. Karen Dipnarayan Suru. After this session, we have voices from the Indian Diaspora. We also have Making of the Indentured Diaspora, Keeping Indian Culture Alive, Girmitiyas in India. We have a repeat session of voices from the Indian Diaspora with 4 different speakers. And we also have Burden of History, again, another repeat session with 3 different speakers. We end the day today with a valedictory session, which starts at 6 p.m. in India. Just a quick update for everybody. I'll request all of our speakers to stick to the time slot given to them. This is only so that we can then have a nice question and answer session towards the end of each session. To all the participants joining us, welcome. And please join on mute because we do not want to disturb our speakers. So let me introduce our first speaker for today, Dr. Kamala Lakshmi Nika. She is a scholar and a dedicated teacher at the University of Fiji. She writes reviews on a range of subjects such as women's writing, post-colonial literature, and creative writing, both in Fiji and internationally. She inhabits a prominent place at the University of Fiji, where she served since the university's inception and is a respected citizen of Nadi. The Study of Bhati Mukherjee is her first major book. She has multiple publications in peer-reviewed journals, book chapters, and short fictions. Dr. Kamala has attended national, regional, and international conferences, and she also supervises master's and PhD students at the university. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Shreya. And I'll start my presentation. Good evening, warm greetings from the University of Fiji, Vanakkam and Bula from Fiji. I would like to start my presentation today by thanking the organizers, the India Foundation, with the support of Overseas Indian Affairs Division of the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, in organizing a 2-day e-conference on Girmitiyas 2021, Changing Identities, Shifting Trends and Roles, for their commitment and dedication to make this a great success. Special thanks to Shreya, Senior Research Fellow with India Foundation, who has been in constant touch with me, and to Alok Bansal Sir, Director, India Foundation, New Delhi, for inviting me to be a guest speaker. The main argument in the paper is that for contemporary Indo-Fijians, the burden of history that they've inherited from Indenture is the burden of interpretation. This presentation is concentrated on burden of history in relation to Fiji and would be incomplete without some discussion on the history of the Indian indentured laborers in Fiji. Slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1833. After that date, Indians were recruited in various ways, usually foul, to work in the very plantations that the freed slaves had hastily left. The conditions of employment were stated on a form of agreement, Girmit, in English, Hindi, and Urdu in North India, and in Tamil, Telugu, and Malayalam in the South. Girmit is a corrupt word for the English word agreement. A labor emigrating under the agreement or Girmit was a Girmitiya. All Girmitiyas were not literate and disguised under voluntary recruitment. In reality, they were made to sign contracts, typically by affixing a thumb impression, and arrived in Fiji, crossing the dark dreaded seas, the Kalapani, to the King Sugar Colony, Fiji. They cleared the Fiji jungle, made roads and tram lines for sugar transportation. This indenture system, an inhumane system, or the labor system, or a new kind of slavery, was introduced in Fiji in 1879 by Sir Arthur Hamilton Gordon, the first governor of the colony, in line with his native policy to protect the Fijian way of life and with his bid to establish Fiji as a viable economy. He believed that imported labor would protect the native population from the damaging effects of industrial agriculture. Gordon had experience of immigrant labor in the form of indentured laborers in Trinidad and Mauritius. He thought that a similar system of indenture bringing Indian immigrants would ensure that Fiji developed economically viable and at the same time exclude the Fijians from the changes that this would bring, giving the indigenous people the time to gradually adjust to the transformation brought by colonial administration. The first cargo of 464 Indian immigrants arrived on the ship Leonidas in May 1879. The arrival of Indian labor together with the Colonial Sugar Refinery Company in 1880 ensured the economic slavery of the colony without prejudice to the Fijians' traditional hierarchical structures as perceived by Governor Gordon. Some 61,000 Girmitiyas arrived in Fiji between 1879 and 1916. Fiji-born descendants of Indian indentured laborers have researched to record the predicaments of their ancestors in far-flung abodes, the heart-rending records of Vijay Mishra's Rama's banishment, the diasporic imaginary and the Indian diaspora, Subramani's the Indo-Fijian experience in Fiji, Vijay Naidu's The Violence of Indenture in Fiji, Ahmad Ali's Girmit, Plantation to Politics, and the Indenture experience in Fiji, and Brijlal's Girmitiyas, The Origin of the Fiji Indians, speak volumes about the traumatic indenture system and its consequences. For the indentured laborers, life seemed to be one of hopeless degradation. The life of Girmitiyas was full of tension, turmoil, and uncertainty. The Girmitiyas survived amidst all these struggles. I wish to begin this task of interpretation, the burden of history, by asserting that there are two common tools in writing history and making fiction. There are two genres of writing that the educated Indo-Fijians have engaged in significantly to make sense of their past. First, the use of language, and secondly, constructing narratives. Another important fact is that they have used the language of the colonizer, that is the English language, to write fiction and history, not the vernacular Hindi. This is another burden for Indo-Fijians, to master the English language as a second language to depict their complex fate and to communicate that to the wider world. Where have they used Hindi or any other language, their works would have remained relatively unknown, not only to the rest of the world, but also in their own community. I shall refer to a historian and a fiction writer to examine how they've endeavored to explore their past. They are Brijlal and Subramani. They have both written extensively about indenture, or what is popularly called Girmit. The historian and the writer of fiction come to the subject through two different routes. The historian's quest is to be empirical and objective. The fiction writer, on the other hand, aspires to make his or her narrative as real as possible by using some of the techniques of the historians. For example, the documentary mode of presentation, it is interesting to observe closely how a historian works with his material. Here is Brijlal writing about the wreck of one of the indenture ships, the Syria, in 1884. I quote, "At 8:30 p.m. on Sunday, 11th May 1884, the Indian immigrant ship Syria was wrecked on the Nasalai Reef. By the time the shipwrecked passengers were brought to safety, 56 immigrants and 3 Lascars that is Indian seamen, had drowned, unquote. Brijlal uses a lot of documentary evidence from the archives to reconstruct this very early history of Indenture. He comes to a very interesting conclusion at the end of his article, which was published by Subramani in his book, The Indo-Fijian Experience. I quote, "The subsequent story of the surviving Syria immigrants cannot be told with certainty. However, from the available records, it appears that after 2 weeks of rest from the exhaustion suffered during the ordeal, the indentured laborers and their children were taken from the Nukala depot to Suva. So how can the subsequent story of the surviving Syria immigrants be told if there is uncertainty?" The historian turns to poet Satyendra Nandan to evoke the memory of that experience. I quote, "Oh, my father's fathers, what forgiveness is there for me? Oh, my children's children, listen to the voice from Syria, drowning the silence of the sea." Unquote. It's not surprising that historians turn to writing fiction by experimenting with what is called faction, where fact and fiction come together. The history of Indenture was from the beginning reported as a story of suffering and oppression. The writings of the only author who emerged from the indenture system, Totaram Sanadia, portrayed the suffering and oppression of the indentured system in Fiji. The inhumanness of Indo-Fijian indenture has attracted the most attention globally from the early years of the 20th century. The Indian indenture system as a whole came under severe criticism from missionaries, humanitarian groups, and activists in the Indian nationalist movement. The activists C.F. Andrews and William Pearson caused uproar in India, as did the earlier invaluable eyewitness accounts by the ex-Girmitiya Totaram Sanadia. In his book, My 21 Years in Fiji, Sanadia, an Indian-born political activist, Pandit, and social worker, wrote about his appalling experience as a Girmitiya. Their reports contributed to the abolition of the Indian indenture system by Britain. The system was terminated in 1916, and in Fiji, the remaining contracts of indenture were cancelled on 1st January 1920. His accounts were used by nationalists in India to agitate for the abolition of the indenture system that involved Mahatma Gandhi. These growing diaspora, many of whom comprise the largest ethnic groups in Gidmit countries, have over the years become a significant force in the development of their countries. They have left a mark in the settled lands, controlling big businesses, and are involved in both local and national level politics. Countries like Fiji has all had Indian descendants leading them, shaping policies and affecting their communities. This tremendous growth is a reflection of the dynamism present within the community. The majority of the descendants of the indentured laborers have moved away from being cane farmers as their lands got reserved and are homeless or landless in a country where their ancestors toiled to make Fiji what it is today. Vijay Mishra says, I quote, "All diasporas are unhappy, but every diaspora is unhappy in its own way," unquote. Though his roots are in India, for an Indian in the diaspora, he still feels an outsider or a foreigner in his homeland. Mishra further claims that the real history of diaspora is always contaminated by social processes and in the end by national forces that govern diasporic subjects' lives. The idea of the lost homeland is triggered by the question in whatever form it is asked, and the trauma repeats. It reinforces the imaginary and darkens consciousness of a racial collective as one sharing space with others, devoid of exclusives and dominating power. No doubt, the yoke of burden is heavy with pitiful emotions, but we should remember the good things as well. The perspective imaginative writers know the sense of freedom that many indentured Indians felt in a new country, the laughter, the camaraderie they enjoyed as Jahaji Bais, and the music and the songs that sustained them through whatever difficulties they faced. The bond between the Jaji Bais, the brotherhood of the crossing, was emotionally powerful and intimate as real blood kinship, which they cherished even after the abolition of Indenture system. More than most literary scholars, Mishra understands the meaning of the burden of interpretation and the responsibility that interpretation entails. Our culture was kept alive by our ancestors in those laborious years. This gives us a great depth of meaning to living. The writers of narratives and history have illuminated and enriched the lives of the descendants of indentured laborers throughout the world and redeemed the stigma that the indentured laborers probably felt that they were the rejects of the Indian subcontinent. Indeed, quality of ancestry reflected strongly in subsequent generations, and the descendants of the indentured laborers as a proud record of success wherever they now live. The Indo-Fijian writers have recreated colonial experience with a deep sense of history. I conclude on a sad note. The indigenous Fijians very loudly ask precisely the question, what do we do with them now of its own Indian diaspora? The Indian diaspora was conveniently forgotten after its abolition in 1920. Their contributions to the country's economy was noted, but not remembered, because with it comes the remembrance of the harsh and inhumane conditions under which the Indians had toiled. Today, the second-class citizens, the Indian descendants of these indentured laborers, are Vulangi, that is meaning visitor in Fiji, weeds to be pulled down and thrown aside, or to be put out to sea in canoes to go back to India. The Indians of Fiji had to contend with not only the loss of homeland and the brutality of plantation life, but also with a series of coups that left lingering discrimination and racism. Intense pain and sorrow emerges from the stories and histories that embody universal truths concerning colonization and the Girmit, the burden of history and the burden of interpretation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nika, for such an interesting speech and also for highlighting the two ways that through language and through the construction of narratives. It was a very interesting perspective that you gave us. I'd like to call on Ms. Karen Dipmeren Sarup next. She herself is a descendant. She's a granddaughter of East Indian immigrants to Trinidad and Tobago, and she's a published author as well. She's joining us from the US, and it's very late for her. So thank you for taking the time out to speak today. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Shreyaji. I'm just going to try to share my screen now. Okay. So, respected and distinguished ladies and gentlemen, namaskar. I am honored to speak at this conference tonight as a deeply grateful great-granddaughter of Indian immigrants to Trinidad and Tobago. My objective today is to share my thoughts and hopefully initiate a dialogue around the issues of Indian indentureship, migration, the burden of history, and challenges to cultural retention. In this paper, I'll be using the words Indian and Hindu interchangeably. The story of the evolution of Hinduism in Trinidad and Tobago is a unique and inspiring narrative of a people striving to retain their culture of being Hindu while remodeling their identity and carving a place of visibility, advancement, and belonging for themselves in the national landscape of the island. 176 years ago, in 1845, the first group of Indians arrived on the shores of Trinidad after more than 100 days of travel across the dreaded Kalapani. Over the next 72 years, hundreds of ships bearing a total of almost 144,000 Indian laborers made their way to the island. 85% of the immigrants were Hindus. Plants, seeds, small family heirlooms, clothing, sacred Hindu texts were all fragments of their culture they brought with them. After long, hot days of strenuous labor in the sugarcane fields, they gathered and rested their weary bodies under the trees on the plantations and sang verses from the Sri Ramcharitmanas of Tulsidas Ji. As they recalled the journey of Sri Ram when he was in exile from his homeland, they felt connected to the soil of their motherland and comforted in this alien land. Those who had no printed text sang from their recollections of the recitations and enactments of this epic story back in India. They retained memories of the ways they had observed or practiced their culture in their villages back in India. When they could not recall the mantras, verses, rituals, and traditions in their entirety, they modified, simplified, condensed, even improvised them. Over time, Hinduism in a form that was distinctly Trinidadian evolved on the island. From the onset, Indians were regarded as strange, different, even barbaric savages because of the unique languages they spoke, as well as their dress, food, value system, and their practice of an ancient religion. To the predominantly Western-oriented African population, Indians were viewed as unwelcome intruders and competitors for the crumbs which fell off the planters' tables. They were regarded as a danger to society and to the church. Until the late 1900s, the education of Indian children had been largely neglected as the governing administration assumed that the Indians would return to India after completing their periods of contract. The Indians were also distrustful of having their children educated by those of a different faith and race and refrained from sending their children to the Canadian Presbyterian mission schools on the island. As such, they were perceived as degenerate, ignorant, and prejudiced. The Canadian missionaries on the island perceived this as an opportunity to proselytize the Indians and made deliberate moves to learn Hindi and the dialects and engage and appeal to the Indians in their own language. These efforts by the missionaries were largely successful. A reasonable number of Indian parents began to send their children to the Presbyterian mission schools because they believed it was a superior offering, as it was patterned along the lines of the Canadian education system, and that education would provide a good economic future for their families. The missionaries taught in Hindi and placed importance on education for girls. Only the Indians who were baptized were allowed to become teachers. The missionaries provided training for teachers in secular and religious work, so the teachers also became preachers. However, it is interesting to note that while a fair number of Hindus were willing to send their children to the mission schools and advance their economic mobility, many were not willing to convert to Christianity and forsake their ancient faith. Over time, the British government allowed Hindu teachers and Purohits to migrate to Trinidad. They performed Hindu religious rites and rituals. In 1923, one visiting Hindu missionary urged the Hindus to keep the honor of their race and practice their own mother tongue. The work of the Hindu missionaries contributed to keeping Hinduism alive. Throughout this time, attempts by Hindus to establish their own schools were not supported financially by the government, whereas the Canadian mission schools were aided by the government. Well, in 1952, this axis of power and influence began to tilt in favor of the Hindus. A young Hindu named Hare Sagan Maharaj rose to the fore. He was determined to eject his family from the throes of poverty, deprivation, and degradation, which they had endured since indentureship. Capitalizing on business deals during the Second World War, Bhadesh earned his first $1 million before the age of 30. In 1952, he formed the Hindu organization Sanatan Dharma Mahasabha and was granted permission to build schools. Bhadesh constructed 6 Hindu schools by September of that year. The mushrooming of Hindu schools across the island prompted Afro-Trinidadian and the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Eric Williams, In his political campaign of 1956 to describe all Hindu schools as cowsheds, Bhades responded, "It is better to have a child receive an education in a cowshed than none at all." This period also marked the inextricable interconnection between politics, race, and Hinduism in Trinidad. While Bhades certainly had his shortcomings, his contribution to education and politics in Trinidad cannot be dismissed. He fought for the rights of oppressed Indian sugar workers by setting up the All Trinidad Sugar Union and established two political parties to represent Indians. These political parties attracted support from the Indian Hindus rather than the Indian Christians and Muslims. In the country's first national election in 1956, Bhades appealed for support from the Sanatanist Hindus along religious and racial lines, but was defeated by the People's National Movement. The PNM secured the support of the Africans, as well as the Presbyterian and Muslim Indians and many of the Arya Samaj Indians. However, when the PNM lost a local election to Bhades's political party in 1958, Eric Williams singled out the Indians as his scapegoat. He branded them a hostile and recalcitrant minority. One Indian leader at that time noted, "It emerged that there were good Indians like myself and bad Indians like those who voted against the PNM." In effect, Eric Williams declared the Indians the enemy and engaged in a campaign to punish the Indians, notably Hindus who did not support them. They took control of the royalties in a booming oil economy and distributed it to most of their supporters. In a country and at a time in which Africans constituted less than 40% of the population, the PNM hired mostly Africans in the state sector in essential services such as the military, police, telecommunication, and water management. There was cultural and religious oppression, as well as the abandonment of agriculture, which was the economic backbone of many Indian families and villages. Over 90% of the government-built housing was allocated to Africans, while there was a lack of development of basic infrastructure like telephone services, electricity, and sewage systems in the rural areas where the Indians and Hindus lived. The Indian populated areas were deprived of community and cultural development, sporting and library facilities, among others. Historian Ram Jagesa notes, in effect, the Africans had institutionalized a system of distributing the lion's share of the resources to their supporters and pain and punishment to their enemies, namely the Hindus. The PNM went on to rule continuously unbroken for 30 years under Eric Williams by actively moving election boundaries to reduce the voting power of the geographically segregated landscape. Amidst all of this, the period saw the upsurge of a second wave of proselytization by evangelical Christians in Trinidad. Pentecostal churches began to infest Hindu villages, but within the Hindu community, a transformation was happening as well. To reverse the exclusion of Hindus from the national landscape, for the first time in 1966, the country witnessed a large-scale celebration of the Hindu festival of Diwali. Lit diyas, food, dress, and public cultural programs enhanced the visual impact of this festival. This was followed closely by the observance of the joyful Holi festival with its vibrant songs, with its vibrant colors and spirited songs, and the water festival of Kartik Nahan, where thousands of Hindus worshipped and took baths on the beaches, all in full view of the public. This decade also saw entire pages in the national media being dedicated to those festivals, as well as Mahashivaratri and Ram Navami. What this achieved was Hindus presenting Hinduism on their own terms and as an integral dimension of Trinidad society. 1966 also witnessed the founding of the Bharatiya Vidya Sansthan by India-born Trinidad-based Professor Adesh, who offered free classes in Hindi, Hinduism, music, dance, and drama, and held annual cultural camps further bolstering the advancement of Hinduism on the island. By the end of the 1970s and early 1980s, there was also a more discerning approach to Hinduism, especially by the younger Hindus who had been educated at the secondary and tertiary levels. They sought a deeper intellectual approach to Hinduism above the qualifications of lineage, limited knowledge, and charm of the Hindu leaders, and exhibited a reluctance to conform to the dictates of gurus and purohits who were guilty of moral indiscretions. Now there were textual reinterpretations and discussions embracing religion and politics in the mandars around topics such as the governing ideals contained in the concept of Ram Rajya and the Ravanization of the oppressive ruling party. It revealed that Hindu politics and religion can have a positive symbiotic relationship where each enhances the other. Hindus became more vocal in public dialogue and were increasingly less submissive to periodic attempts to pacify them. The inauguration of Diwali Nagar in 1986 shifted Diwali from being celebrated at mainly the community level to the national stage. Now hundreds of thousands of Hindus and non-Hindus were sharing in the experience of Indian foods, cultural art forms, and dress while being educated on the fundamental tenets of Hinduism. It also brought different Hindu sects under one umbrella to showcase the uniqueness of their precepts and practices. In this latter part of the century, there was a marked increase in socio-religious education and activism as well. The Indian Revival and Reform Association propelled the declaration of Indian Arrival Day. Hindu Seva Sangh was instrumental in establishing the Sivda Sadhu Mandir, which honors the determination of an Indian indentured hero to defy British rule and construct the first mandir in the sea. Hindu Swayam Sevak Sangh, Hindu Prachar Kendra, Chinmaya Mission, and others, these organizations all sought to counter the persistent efforts by Christian evangelicals and missionaries to proselytize Hindus and fortify Hindu identity and distinction in the national landscape. This era saw the return of numerous Hindu missionaries who had been trained in India. They offered intellectual interpretations of Hinduism on the Singhasans at the community and national levels, and more informative and educational supplements in the national media and the newly formed Indian press. What ultimately evolved was a marked religio-cultural renaissance, especially in the 1980s. In conclusion, today, with the PNM party still in governance, Hindus still face or are still facing myriad forms of oppression, aggressive conversion by Christian missionaries, interracial marriages, and large-scale migration by those who are unable to envision a viable future for themselves, are causing the once large Hindu population in Trinidad to diminish. It is estimated that there are about 300,000 Indo-Trinidadians living abroad, most of whom are Hindus. Compare this with the estimated 250,000 Hindus currently residing in Trinidad, and the historical impact on our people is staggering. Hindus who have migrated to places like the US and Canada, where they do not face similar oppressive pressures as in their homeland, are flourishing. Hinduism among these migrants in the Trinidad diaspora is thriving. The intention to keep something alive posits that a threat exists. This is a broad subject, and I've touched on just a few of the threats still facing Hindus in Trinidad. However, even with the burden of history above them, the Desh-Kal Paristiti, which is place, time, circumstance approach to cultural retention and advancement, has proven to be successful in every instance. It has served to lift them out of the murky quagmire of being scorned and ridiculed as second or even lower class citizens into finding a more balanced space of being Hindu and Trinidadian and into prominent leadership spaces in the national landscape. Hindus in Trinidad are poised for a return to their power if they can mobilize themselves and function from a place of strength and unity once more. Thank you.
Thank you, Karanji, for taking us on a journey through Trinidad and how politics, economic oppression, and race tensions presented challenges to keeping Indian culture alive. We will now move on to our next speaker, Dr. Nalani Moodle. She's Executive Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Design in Pretoria, South Africa. She has a BA and MA, MBA and a UPGCE, and also completed a PhD in art history, focusing on the visual art produced by Indian South Africans. Her present areas of research include the politics of minorities, as well as the complexities of race and identity politics within a transforming South Africa. Her focus is on the challenges of being Indian in a post-apartheid South Africa, while also engaging in projects that attempt to memorialize the history of Indian indenture. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Shreya, for the kind word. Vanakkam, namaskar, namaste to all my colleagues, and greetings to all the honored guests and speakers. To the organizers of the India Foundation, I want to say thank you for the invitation to participate in this phenomenal conference. It really is indeed an honor. I must try and just share my screen, if you just bear with me. Are you able to see it?
Not yet. We can see that you've started sharing your, yes, we can see it now.
Okay. Let me put it on slideshow. Are you able to see it now?
Yes, we can see it.
Fantastic. At the outset, I must indicate that my area of specialization is the visual arts, visual culture, and as Shreya indicated in my introduction. And it's really particularly looking at how South Africa and Indian South Africans conceive and locate and identify themselves within a broad post-apartheid South Africa. As an art historian, I wanted to explore the theme of the burden of history through the thread of visual arts and cultural symbols created by South African artists of Indian descent. These artists explore their burdens of history through a trope of visuals emanating from photographs, but fundamentally leading to installations and mixed media. This exploration emerges through a selection of female artists who offer gendered narratives of memory, identity, and heritage, exposing the burden their histories carry as their personal narratives. Incidentally, September in South Africa is recognized as Heritage Month, and this really weighed heavily on the conceptualization of this paper, particularly on a national level, and in light of the recent unrest and the attached racial divisions that emerged, and the burning question of how we reconcile the image and image-making process with identity, heritage, and nation building in a place we call home, and yet a place with a consistent sense of alienhood. South Africa is deeply divided, and these divisions are evident along the lines of race, ethnicity, language, and gender. Race is certainly central to South African politics, but interracial or ethnic divisions are also significant in reinforcing intolerance and causing people to typically develop strong in-group positive identity and strong out-group animosities. This causes division of a country into friends and foes, undermining any sense of tolerance and unity. South African Indians have, since the arrival of indentured Indians in 1860, had to manage various political upheavals and violence directed towards them. The animosity they met with at their arrival in 1860, to the 1949 riots, the 1985 Inanda riots, and more recently, the riots of August 2021. These are a consistent reminder of their sense of alienation and isolation on the southern tip of Africa. This deep fracture in Durban resulted in an eerie chant, "One Indian, one bullet, one bullet, one Indian," which occurred not so long ago on the steps of the Durban City Hall. Against this turmoil, raising questions about is this place home becomes permanent and pertinent. However, amidst that dialogue, Indians are still facing cultural embedded norms and practices which perpetuate a sense of homogeneous sense of Indianness and thereby somehow denying transformative realities. The purpose of the paper, though, is not to delve into the specifics of these riots, which will really be an entirely different discussion, but to position the Indian experience against the backdrop of these very traumatic events. Incidentally, I have a very short clip that I can show you of this very recent riot in August, should there be time at the end of my presentation. The notion of othering broadly and gendered positions more specifically is considered by the artists I will discuss today. The artwork captures narratives of Indian cultural history where identity is brought into sharp focus as a result of a crisis created by something that causes displacement or uncertainty or fractures in that community. Due to limited time, I want to quickly get to the artworks. The four artists are established visual artists and reflect on their experiences as South African women of Indian ancestry. Alka Das is a multidisciplinary artist whose work interrogates cultural ideals and is a visual psychological examination of the cultural spaces that they traditionally occupy. She explores her own experiences via found objects, mixed media, and through co-opting commonly found objects in Indian homes. Her works are created with embedded constructs of female identity and Indian domesticity. In this work titled Fast Car, the photograph is printed on a doily and is surrounded by embroidery typical of women's handicraft. Of course, the act of crocheting or embroidery or stitching is an act of memorialization and threading memories together into some narrative of history. It is an aspect of how contemporary culture uses craft as a means of connecting with the sacred, and in this case, a sacred history. Stitching is further a material memorialization of wider trends like the sacralization of the family, the preoccupation of the past, and the seeking of the connection with that which is perceived to have been lost. Alka Das uses thread as a means to honor heritage and uncover marginalized histories. This also makes space for reflection through commemoration and perhaps through grieving, thereby maintaining the presence of the past and providing some sort of tactile comfort in the face of the loss of that memory or history. Thus, the history and memory of the doily represents one layer of memory, with a stitched photograph representing another layer of memory, and the embroidery, an attempt to merge the past and the present, creating a contemporary response to one's heritage. Of course, the humble doily is no stranger to many Indian homes in South Africa. As a sign of pride and success and used to cover many items, as you can see in an Indian home. It is used to speak back to the past, to flatten memory into a transformed identity and sense of self, and create a reminder of the place called home. The photograph used what was certainly a sign of wealth and prestige at the time was the underlying sense of embedded or perhaps entrenched patriarchy. This adds a further layer of burden onto the image as it puts into sharp focus patriarchy as opposed to the women's work or notions of domesticity as evidenced in the foundational construction of Vaskar, which is the humble doily. Patriarchy in the Indian community was not uncommon, and much has been written about the second-classness of women in this community since Indenture. Finally, the fragility of the aging doily, the fragility of the aging images create objects that act as tactile memory. The burden of history is thus conveyed not just in the moment of time the picture was captured, but also in the fragility of the image that is here exposed, conveying a rather nostalgic intimacy. Shaleen Khan is explores the history of Indian women in South Africa in a way that deals with poverty, systemic abuse by employers, and often domestic abuse too. Generations later, these struggles continue, and Shaleen Khan recalls remembering growing up with stories of the many Indian women who committed suicide by burning, drowning, or hanging as the only way to get out of their problems. This photographic series, titled Drowning Durgas, references these attempts to escape untenable situations. Durga is the Hindu goddess who symbolizes feminine energy and who combats evil and demonic forces. During the Durga Puja, following a period of fasting and prayer, Hindus immerse clay statues of Durga into rivers, believing that the goddess carries with her all their sins. Khan photographs herself masquerading as Durga while floating in a river and hanging from a tree within this sari, the red-colored sari draped around her. These images create a powerful sense of the despair that many women must have felt due to their harsh living conditions, yet it comments on the strength and resilience of these women as second-class citizens as well. The history and experience of the indentured laborers in South Africa is largely unknown by the broader South African society. Few South Africans know of the history of Indian indenture, nor the inhumane and brutal conditions under which most indentured women were forced to live in this country. These images assist in telling stories of forgotten histories, thereby allowing us to acknowledge and understand the past. Perhaps her work reminds us that as Indian South Africans, our experiences are multidimensional and complicated in South Africa, where the ongoing challenge for this place called home calls into question our identity construction. Despite the recent changes in women's roles in South Africa, domesticity still tends to become women's work. The COVID pandemic has escalated this imbalance in society, where through enforced working from home modalities, women continue as main caregiver and domestic worker and career woman and so on. In her commentary on women's work, Usha Sijaram highlights the ritual-like repetition and humility that domestic work demands. Women of Indian heritage experience the duality of modernity balanced with traditional homemaker, hereby critiquing her own cultural identity, which pervades her installation. Thus, the phenomenon of escaping from the daily chores of homemaking and returning to the everyday coexist in her life as homemaker and career artist. Sijaram's language as an artist has been nurtured and informed by her rich heritage of her diasporic Indian environment and culture. She asks pertinent questions about identity, nationality, culture, and again, the concept of home through her fascination with the apparent mundane and ordinary. Sisters-in-Law is here a witty commentary on that which creates Hindu familial bonds amongst women entering a family. The rituals of wedding bangles and the ritualized task of domestic work of sweeping or ironing is brought for consideration. Further, the nesting demands of an Indian mother in maintaining a home for a family once again complicates the question of a place of home for Indian South Africans. In the last artist, Reshma Tiba presents 4 photographs of the backs of Indian women. In the first, Unawakened, we are presented with a young Indian girl, seemingly on the brink of womanhood, with pierced ears, long hair in a plait down her back. Restrained features a mature married woman as indicated by her sari and her thali or mangalsutra. In stripped, the woman clearly is older, wears no jewelry, and her head is shaven, perhaps indicating her status as a widow. While this might have been practiced, it is no longer in practice here, but perhaps as a widow, she is expected to wear white, indicated in her sari. In the last image, Unbridled, we are featured with a young naked woman with long, unkempt and disheveled hair. This work is commentary on traditional Indian families where women subscribe to certain norms for how their hair should be worn. Long, luxuriant hair is the cultural ideal and has always been regarded as an important aspect of a woman, an Indian woman's beauty. Hair is thus used as a metaphor for women's position in life. The rigid social norms that still dictate and control Indian women's modesty and behavior is challenged by Chiba's fourth image, which suggests a break in normativity. In conclusion, these four women deal with issues of identity, race, and gender as relevant now as they were during indenture or apartheid. They recognize their racialized position in South Africa against an outlook that is affected by westernization, urbanization, by living in Africa, and by being of Indian descent. Very much like the burdens the images carry, the body carries the same memories and the same burdens. Being Indian in South Africa is to be faced daily with a society that looks at race, gender, and ethnicity as unique yet burdensome markers of history to make meaning. As South Africans, the sense of nationhood has shifting positions which often stereotype and reinforce interpretations of what it means to be Indian in South Africa. The images I discussed today are alongside transformations that subtly reflect an integration into South African society and lead towards a possible consequential sense of assimilation. I thank you. Here, if there is a couple of seconds, I would like to just share that video of the protest in August. Would that be possible?
Yes, please do.
Thank you. It's a very short clip, but it was protests that emerged during the August riots, which was subsequent to the incarceration of former President Jacob Zuma. What emerged was the loss of almost 350 lives, and 36 of those happen to be African people who have lost their lives in the Indian township of Phoenix. And subsequent to that was this very, very challenging protest that happened on the steps of Durban. Thank you, Shreya. I just wanted to share that so that we have an overall perspective of where we are located. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. So I'll open up the floor now for some questions. If anybody has questions to ask, please raise your hand and we'll unmute you. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Shirley. This is Ashna. Good evening, everyone. I do not have a question, but I would like to thank Madam for deliberating on such an important aspect of our tradition. Here in Fiji, doilies are also common. And now when I think about it, when I look back, then yes, indeed, they represent the oppression that our forefathers faced when they came as laborers, as outsiders to this country. Thank you. It gave me a lot to think about as to how women are being treated, were being treated, and are still being treated in their household and in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashna, for your comment. Alex, if you can go ahead.
I have just a question for all three of them, actually. For Dr. Kamala, I just wanted to know, you talked about the various military coups, etc., which led to the persecution of ethnic Indians in Fiji. But for some time now, Commodore Bainimarama has actually been trying to integrate the society by talking of Fijians and no Indo-Fijians and native Fijians. And he's also removed many institutionalized systems which actually discriminated certain bodies which had been actually enacted, which actually deprived Indians of their due share, like body of chiefs, the Council of Chiefs, etc. So has there been some improvement? Although I agree, because of huge migration that took place during Sitiveni Rabuka's coup, after Sitiveni Rabuka's coup, I think the ethnic Indians numbers have come down below the native Fijians. But is there a better environment existing in Fiji? To Madam Nalini, I have a question as to why was this sort of a writing which we saw, because the supporters were of Zuma, and Zuma was being accused of being within an Indian industrial group of Guptas. So why was this their ire directed against ethnic Indians, who in any case should have been considered as allies of Jacob Zuma? So why this writing took place this sort of a direction? And to Karen, I just wanted to know, this is a question which I asked yesterday also. One of the reasons for reducing the numbers of Girmitiyas is the tendency amongst ethnic Indians not to include the mixed races, the Doglas or others who are actually intermarrying. You also said one of the causes intermarriages, interracial marriages. But anybody marrying interracially, we have not made an endeavor to actually incorporate them within our fold rather than excluding them. Why is that? In fact, this is what an issue which was pointed out yesterday also. And I just, these three questions, I'll be grateful. Thank you so much.
Any of the panelists can take it over. Yeah.
Sir, I'm Kamala speaking.
Yeah.
Coming back to your question. Yes, coups have taken place. There has been a change with Prime Minister Bainimarama coming in, and still there were issues like Indians, their lands got reserved and they became landless and homeless, and many of them who were cane farmers are not cane farmers anymore. So they have changed their profession or their work and their livelihood. So there can be a difference. I'm not saying there is no difference. There is a difference, but it all depends how it is taken. Whether racism is still there or not, maybe it is there. It depends how people look at it. So I would say to your question that yes, there is a difference after Rambuka with Bainimarama government, but then things cannot completely change. And I hope that things will change for the betterment of the Indo-Fijians.
Thank you, Mr. Alok, for the question regarding the riots. I think you're so right. Of course, the riots emerged as a response to the incarceration of the former president, Jacob Zuma. But a lot of this has to do with the planning of, and we can very easily tie it down to the structure of apartheid and the Group Areas Act. In the urban design, areas or townships are located in very particular environments. So you would have a white community, an Indian community, and then an African community sort of isolated in that way. So the African and Indian communities are very close together. And I think part of this protest and anti-Indian sort of sentiment is not new to South Africa. We experience it often. We experience it during Diwali, where there are now human rights issues in terms of the firecrackers that affect animal rights. And that argument is silent during Guy Fawkes or New Year's Eve, etc., etc. But what has happened here is the riots sort of got out of control in an attempt of looting, and I'm sure you all seen it on the television and various news channels, the looting and the criminality that followed those protests. And as a result, this looting with hundreds of thousands of people moving along different spaces led to homes being threatened. And when homes were threatened, communities rallied together to protect their home. And that's what happened in Phoenix. Many community members gathered together in light of the fact that there was no police protection. The army, although it was asked to protect communities, were nowhere to be seen. Communities had to protect themselves. And as a vulnerable community, they protected, and whenever there was an infiltration, apparently some untoward behavior happened. But amidst all of this, we have about 350 people who lost their lives, and about 30 of those apparently, allegedly, due to community violence as in the Indian community having attacked those African people entering the Indian townships. Subsequent to that, I mean, of course, investigations are ongoing, but subsequent to that, these sort of what was now being called the Phoenix Massacre by the Indians gave rise to this lobby group. And this type of sentiment was perpetuated through social media, through the television news channels, through radio news channels, that it was a deliberate attack of Africans by Indians. And this led to the one Indian, one bullet sentiment, which definitely creates chaos, anarchy, and fear that is perpetuated in South Africa against the South African Indian. And very little seems to be done, either through the Human Rights Commission or investigation to actually bring all of this alienation and alienhood to book. So I hope that that's clarified the question. Thank you very much.
To answer your question, Alokji, so as I pointed out, from our history, the Africans tended to view the Indians as lesser than when they came to the islands to work as laborers on the plantations. They even thought that the Indians had come and taken their jobs, even though they didn't want those jobs anymore. So the ancestors in that time, if someone were to have an interracial marriage with an African, it would have been viewed as a betrayal. Times are changing. The newer generation is mixing with the Africans. The Durgas are going to the Hindu mandirs and they're singing bhajans. They're certainly part of the Diwali Nagar, which happens every year. And you have like hundreds of thousands of Hindus and non-Hindus, Indians and non-Indians who come together in a place that has been, that is looked at now as a pilgrimage spot where no alcohol, no meat is being served. And they respect our culture in that setting. So I think change takes time, and we are seeing gradual changes happening. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you to our speakers for taking the time out and for answering the questions. I don't think we have more time for another question. So we'll move on to the next session. Thank you again to all of our speakers who joined us today for this session. Our next session is Voices from the Indian Diaspora. We have 3 speakers today. We'll start with Mr. Anand Jairaj, who has been a practicing attorney for the past 4 decades and lives in South Africa. He is actively involved in community work and has held official posts in various organizations involved in cultural and welfare. He has an interest in the history of Indian indenture of Hindi language. He has written several articles on Indian indenture for multiple publications. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Shreya. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
And I hope that you can see me, but I think it's more important that you hear me rather than see me. Right. Greetings to India Foundation, the organizers, and to all guests, presenters, and participants. Thanks for the privilege of allowing me to participate in this program. I am not an academic, historian, or intellectual, but just an ordinary descendant of the Indentured Girmitiya with an interest in history. I wish everyone well during these challenging times that have been compounded by the COVID pandemic. In the various presentations, no doubt, there will be overlapping and repetitions. And of course, the presenters do crave your indulgence and tolerance in this regards. Also, I'm sure that guests and participants and all those of Girmitiya persuasion will find much common resonance in what presenters have already spoken about and what will indeed be spoken about later on. Now, the Girmit Diaspora. My topic is the voices from Girmit Diaspora. It's quite a wide thing, but I'll try to encapsulate as much as possible. First of all, labor, slavery, and indenture. They are spoken of in virtually the same breath. Now, Indian diaspora generally refers to Indian nationals living abroad or overseas. For our purposes herein, in talking about Girmitiya, I shall include the descendants of Indian indentured laborers presently living in various former European colonies. As I mentioned, labor, slavery, indenture, and the consequences are usually spoken of in the same breath. Now, the voices from Girmitiya diaspora will inevitably articulate and also echo the memories of labor, slavery, indenture, and the consequences thereof. Slavery is an ancient form of exploited labor that entailed forced captive labor and had nothing to do with contract or agreement as such. Now, indenture is also an ancient form of labor that involved a contract or an agreement, whence the term Girmit was coined, and I think a speaker yesterday indicated how the word Girmit and Girmitiya came about from the word agreement. In many instances, in the indenture system, the weak bargaining position of the laborer lent itself to gross exploitation by the employer. The proverbial playing field was not level. We need to talk about abolition of slavery. As we are all no doubt aware, from 1830s onward, slavery was being abolished in many European colonies. Farmers and industrialists in the colonies then turned their attention to importing a form of cheap labor from India under the indenture system. And I'm sure many of the speakers have spoken about it and will speak about it. But like I mentioned, there may be inevitable overlapping and repetition. Now, the laborers were recruited in India mainly in the then known United Provinces in the north and the Madras Presidency in the south. They were taken to far-flung places like Mauritius, Reunion, Fiji, East Africa, Colony of Natal, Suriname, and the Caribbean islands in the West Indies. The West Indies with those islands with beautiful and exotic sounding names like Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, Grenada, St. Lucia, British Guyana, Barbados, just to name a few. Apologies if I missed out some of them. Now, the colony of Natal, situated in the southeast of Africa, is now part of my fatherland, South Africa. Of course, in a lighter tone, if you want to know where South Africa is, it is a country in the south of Africa. Now, what set the Indian indenture system apart from the traditional concept of the ancient indenture system? Now, during the period spanning almost 90 years from around mid-1830s to about 1917, reportedly between 1.5 to 2 million Indian indentured laborers who referred to themselves and became known as Girmitiyas. Now, they were transported from India to these various European colonies scattered around the world, which I have already mentioned. Now, they were taken there to toil on the European colonial farms and industries. Now, what is the significance of that? Now, my study shows that it was perhaps the largest migration, and you can even refer it to as a mass migration of Indian indentured laborers that ever took place in human history. The vast majority of people of Indian descent who now constitute these diasporas consist of people who can trace their ancestries to these Indian indentured laborers or Girmitiyas. Right. So now, having set the background, we can talk about voices from Girmitiya diaspora, which in itself is a very wide canvas, and I'll try to see how much that I can squeeze in the limited time that we have in this presentation. Now, the voices from diaspora may in some instances articulate positives and in other instances sound out concerns about negatives like discrimination, bias, and typecasting. Now, in order for the voices of Girmitiyas to be heard by the intended targets, they should be measured, articulated in unison, and not become a cacophony. As you are no doubt aware, the indentured Indian laborers or Girmitiyas in the European colonies endured and suffered many hardships and atrocities, faced numerous political, economic, social, and other challenges. Now, the present descendants of these Girmitiyas, after several generations, have indeed integrated themselves as integral and patriotic citizens of their respective countries of their birth. Because they embrace much of Indian culture, they are viewed with, or sometimes viewed with much reservation, suspicions, and sometimes, and in some instances, with resentment and disdain. I will now come to the aspect, a very important aspect of patriotism. In saying so, I wish to emphasize that to the best of my knowledge and belief, the voices from the Girmitiya diaspora throughout the world loudly proclaim in unison patriotism and love for the respective countries of birth. I stand to be corrected, but I think I will not be challenged on that score. All of our Girmitiya diaspora will love our countries. Now, for instance, in South Africa, we of Indian descent have indeed time and again proudly declared ourselves patriotic citizens of South Africa. And this voice must be spelled out very, very clearly to all and sundry. And it has been articulated many times and in various quarters. I am closely associated with organizations like the 1860 Indentured Laborers Foundation of Verulam. Time and again, our publications and manifesto clearly declare this patriotism. The Hindi Shiksha Sangh, which is a non-profit organization which was established in 1948 promoting the Hindi language, for instance, also subscribes to this tenet. It regularly and proudly broadcasts the theme through its community radio station Hindwani. Of course, you will be able to reach Hindwani on audio streaming. Now, Hindi Shiksha Sangh also embraces the concept of our patriotism. The 1860 Heritage Center, the Hindu Mahasabha, the Arya Pratidindi Sabha, the Bazme Adab, and many, many other organizations that are involved in religion, cultural, linguistic, and other activities, too numerous to mention here, also subscribe to this patriotic theme. And that's very, very important for us to make sure we, from the voices of the diaspora, need to know that coupled with our association and our inspiration that we get from India, we are patriotic citizens of the countries of our birth, and we love our respective countries very, very deeply. Let us not detract from that one theme. Now, I wish to make some pertinent and salient observations and comment thereon. This in the hope that they will adequately echo the voices from the diaspora as widely as possible. Admittedly, in all societies and groupings of people, there will be the so-called bad apples in the barrel. But let us park that for one side. Negative issues later on herein, but let us touch on some of the positive for the time being. Progress made by the diasporas. Having said that, the voices from the Girmitiya loudly proclaim that there is no gainsaying or denying that by far and large, the Girmit diasporas have made tremendous progress in their respective countries. They have indeed contributed positively and significantly to the development of their respective countries in all walks of life, right, and in many spheres of human endeavors for that matter. The voices further proclaim that the progress made by the Girmitiya diasporas are the culmination of hard work, dedication, perseverance, and the will to succeed. A curious and perhaps a bizarre situation is that in a few countries, I'm not sure in all the diasporas, but in a few countries, and more especially in South Africa, the diasporas find themselves in a situation in which they themselves have become the victims of their own successes. But political exigencies and expediencies, as well as demand for the so-called political correctness, have served to stifle, mute, or even stultify the voices of diasporas. If these voices are unmuted, they will no doubt vouch for the fact that they have been and still are victims and the butt of discrimination, bias, and resentment. I now come to the point of voicing or echoing our voice on education. It would indeed be remiss of me and perhaps a travesty if I did not mention education. The voices from diaspora recognize a common and important thread that is woven into and permeates the fabric of every diaspora. And that was and still indeed is the emphasis and importance placed on education. I must mention that emphasis on education is by no means the only common thread, but it was and still is a very, very important one throughout the history of diaspora. In passing, I would also like to mention that you will not find Girmitiya diaspora destroying schools and libraries. The Girmitiya forebears played active part in encouraging and even building and preserving educational institutions. So I would just like to park that, but highlight the importance that the Girmitiyas and the descendants have played on education. Having said that, amongst the various voices from the diaspora, the loudest one should undoubtedly be our collective thanks to our Girmitiya forebears for the sacrifices they made in overcoming extreme hardships, atrocities, abuse, and challenges of varying degrees and types, and delivering to us a life far better than they, the Girmitiyas themselves, ever enjoyed. I now come to another aspect of, sorry, I'm rushing over on short headings. There's so much to cover, but I need to cover another important aspect, social
2
cohesion
minutes
and
left.
nation building program in SA, in South Africa. Now, there is a government-sponsored program in South Africa referred to as a social cohesion and national building programs. It is aimed at bridging the divides among the various groupings in this country. This month is Heritage Month in South Africa, as the previous speaker had mentioned, with Heritage Day set to be observed on the 27th of September. Just 2 days ago, the Berlin Indentured Laborers Foundation held a discourse on Zoom platform in pursuance of this social cohesion program, and this was held on Wednesday during this Heritage Month. And what I must mention about the Indentured Laborers Foundation of Berlin, in 2018, this foundation held a very successful national conference of Indenture in the year 2018, which was perhaps the most successful and largest conference on indenture in perhaps in the continent of Africa. I'd just like to mention that about the good work that the Vellum Indentured Laborers and the 1860 Heritage Foundation are doing in this particular field. There are a number of other organizations also involved. You notice that in South Africa, the figure 1860 features very well. That is because it was in November 1860 that the first batch of Indian laborers from India arrived in South Africa. Right. Now, notwithstanding the setbacks caused by certain radical elements, attempts at social cohesion and nation building should continue unabated, even if they seem to be elusive derived from the word eluded, and elusive, the word that is derived from illusion. So even if it seems elusive and elusive, this it may be an elusive and elusive dream, but it must be pursued with a lot of vigor and unabatedly. It's very, very important for social cohesion.
So I'm
Now
sorry
I come
to
to
interrupt. We've run out of time. Could I ask you to wrap up, please?
all right. Okay, I will then, in that particular case, I'll just quickly, I may be mistaken here and stand to be corrected, but perhaps many people may be ignorant about certain essential aspects of their own history and history of other relevant groups as well. This may well contribute to compounding the problems and challenges facing the Girmitiya diasporas. In including myself, I venture to state that in order to render the voices of Indenture valid and legitimate, it is imperative that Girmitiyas learn about their history, educate themselves about the past, and arm themselves with cogent and sustainable arguments to counter negative criticisms and accusations that may be leveled against them. We can indeed reach out, find one another, and bridge the divides with education and knowledge. I will leave it at that. Time is a constraint. There's so much more that I want to speak about, but of course, I hope that in some way that I have echoed the voices of diaspora fairly adequately within this limited time. Thank you, Shreya.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for giving us your lovely presentation. I'm going to move on to our next speaker, Mr. Ajay Chabra, who's a proud son of a partition survivor and a freedom fighter and the great-grandson of an indentured laborer. He was born and raised in London with strong Indian roots. His curiosity with life and death and everything in between resulted in the creation of award-winning outdoor performance company Natkut with Simi Gupta. Natkut creates festivals, digital artworks, and theatrical movements which bring people together under single universal experiences. As an actor, Mr. Chabra works on 3 continents. Currently, he's starring on screen in Bollywood's latest release, Bell Bottom, and in Hollywood with Tom and Jerry. Mr. Ajay Chabra's mission is to work with the private and public sector in bringing the global Girmit diaspora that call India home together. Over to you, sir.
Shreya, thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Great. So you can see that, can you?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay. Right. 15 minutes, yeah? I'm going to press start on my stopwatch. Distinguished guests, colleagues, and newfound friends, namaste, and thank you for this opportunity to engage with the India Foundation and with colleagues from around the world with a subject that is very close to both my personal and my professional life. Firstly, my sincere thanks go to Alok sir for your incredibly speedy response via WhatsApp and your equally efficient colleagues, Shreya and Shrishti, who within hours of me reaching out made me feel completely part of the Girmit conference. We are who we are by the teams we build around us, and it's clear you have a dedicated and talented team. My name is Ajay Chabra, as I've said, and I'm an actor and a producer of creative and cultural projects across film festivals in the museum and heritage sectors. I'm the proud son of a partition survivor, a freedom fighter, and the great-grandson of an indentured laborer. Nutcut, which is the company that I run, means mischief in Hindi. It's a company based in London with a global reach. Led by myself and Simi Gupta, we are proud advocates of our Indian heritage, and with a childlike, playful sensibility, we attempt to win the hearts and minds of many, because it's through play we learn, and it's through a nut-cut, playful approach we develop instinctive, creative, and spontaneous skills for life. We believe we're curious. We always ask questions. We're interested in culture. We feel that we're relevant, and we also enjoy partnerships. As the child of a partition survivor, I've grown up with the stories of my family's fight for freedom and for building a better future. We're the first generation in 200 years to stay in one place. Every generation since we came along has moved from village to town, from city to country, and from region to continent. Politics and policies motivated those moves. From place to place, there was no time to play. And the golden thread that has kept us connected has been our Indian culture, our faith, through dance, music, fashion, art, and food. And Nutcut has emerged to fulfill the cultural context of the diaspora communities across the world, from the Girmit communities in Mauritius, the Caribbean, Fiji and the Pacific communities, to the Punjabi young men who headed to post-war Britain to South Indian men and women who headed for the Middle East, to the workers of South Africa and beyond, the Gujarati communities from East Africa, to that first wave of Indian software students who headed for the US in the early 80s. Wave after wave after wave, we salute you for the sacrifices you have made. We're all connected through our culture, and Nutcut thrives and survives and inhabits those spaces that connect us emotionally, physically, and spiritually with India. Every single visit I make to India, I've always felt the same emotion. I depart from the seat, I leave the aircraft, and when I touch the soil of India, my heart starts to beat. Tears come to my eyes. It's as though the comforting, soft, and welcoming arms of Mother India are wrapping themselves around me. I'm here today to share with you the project we have created called the Girmit Experience. The Girmit Experience is a global arts and technology project created to amplify the story of Indenture to a new generation. Defining Moments is a body of work which I've been creating over the past 6 years. We've taken 3 key and significant moments in global history that has had a direct and profound impact on the movement of Indians across the world. We started in 2016 with Dr. Blighty, marking the centenary of World War I, and to reflect and remember the contribution made by over 1 million Indian young men. These men had been forgotten in Europe and in the United Kingdom, and therefore my mission was to change that. We achieved support, and as a result of this history, is now being taught in schools in the UK. They'd often been described as illiterate village recruits. We changed the language. We described them as poet warriors from the lands of Hiranja, the lands of epic literature and poetry, and we told this story through the eyes of an 18-year-old man. Now, for those of you who can see my presentation, our mission was to ensure that there was a flame was kept alive by remembering these poet warriors. This was the story of one of my great-great-grandparents. Our second project was to mark the 70th anniversary in 2018 of the largest mass migration the world has ever seen, the partition of India, seen through the eyes of an 8-year-old girl. And the final project in this trilogy is the Girmit Experience, marking the 100th anniversary of the abolition of Indenture as the final Girmitiya served their contracts. This project pays tribute to our elders and was seen through the eyes of 2 80-year-olds, my Paranana and Nani, my maternal great-grandparents. So let's just focus now on Girmit. The Girmit Experience was conceived at the very start of the pandemic, and as a result of the untimely loss of my mother, who died as a result of COVID-19 during the first wave in March 2020. This framed everything and our entire approach, reconnecting with many hundreds of relatives across the world, paying their respects, coming together to grieve. Following numerous Zoom calls, it became evident the global need for belonging, intimacy, and connection. The whole world was going through similar emotions. I began to gather a team of artists, academics, archivists, neuroscientists, actors, technologists, graphic designers, virtual reality and augmented reality specialists from across the world. And as a result of lockdowns, this became so much more possible. People were at home, ready to connect, needing to connect. And I wanted a range of specialists to uncover and dive deep into the world of Girmit, its causes and its effects. Our motivation was to create a lasting Girmit legacy that would motivate new audiences and younger people. How do we tell the same story to different audiences? And now, where do you start if you have no clues or objects or heirlooms? No books or no stories. Our Girmitiya has traveled with next to nothing. So our starting point for me was my great-grandfather's emigration pass. In 1995, I traveled to Fiji for a cousin's wedding with traditions you would see in rural Bihar, Uttar Pradesh or Madhya Pradesh to this day. Traditions of 150 years ago kept alive on an island in the Pacific. On that trip with my curious nutcut sensibility, I searched and discovered his emigration pass in the Fiji archives. Known as Lali Maharaj, I discovered his birth name was Bhagwan Ram Mishra. After he served his 5 years of indenture, he opened a shop, a sweet shop, in Fiji. And in his lifetime, he transformed his life and that of his future generations. He generated wealth, he donated land, he became a well-loved and respected philanthropist. The bittersweet irony of the product which enslaved him, sugar, became his liberator. The next object I had was my Parnani's chakki, or flour grinder, the only object brought from India which now sits in the Fiji Museum to mark the history of Girmitiyas. Donated by my Nana, my grandfather, when she died. This chakki fed 5 generations of our family and our community. Thousands of people would have eaten the roti and the chapatis, which would have been ground by her hands, spices, dal and wheat. The symbolic meaning of these 2 heavy rocks was so deep and so significant. And finally, in this slide, you can see just behind the chakki is a picture of a ship. This is the ship known as the Ems, the name of the ship, built in Glasgow in the 19th century and used to transport Indians to the Caribbean and then to Fiji. I often wondered about the conditions of life on those ships, cramped, disease-ridden, packed. Many young men and children had never seen the sea. They were from largely landlocked rural communities. And as Shreya mentioned in my introduction, last summer I was filming in Glasgow for a film, Bell Bottom. I discovered in the hotel that we were staying in was 20 minutes walk from the shipbuilding yards. I convinced some of the other actors to join me. They thought I was mad, but I wanted to be as close as I could to the symbolic objects of where these instruments of Indenture and Girmit were made and manufactured, and where they were profited. These 3 objects helped me set forward on my quest. These are my great-grandparents, Lali Maharaj and Sita Maharaj. Lali Maharaj, Bhagwan Ram Mishra, walked from his village in Satohari in Madhya Pradesh to Bilaspur, 200 miles away, in a time where phones didn't exist and traveling by train was not an option. He registered for Indenture and then traveled on to Calcutta, 450 miles away. He never turned back home to inform his family. The voyage took 3 months. He was 14 years old. Sita Maharaj was born in Fiji 2 decades earlier. Her father, born in Ayodhya, was one of the first Indians to set foot on Fiji soil, a brave, fearless, and pioneering Girmitiya. And since then, 125 years or so later, the actions of that 14-year-old boy has resulted in his family living across the world, me included here in London. That child in us all experiences new things all the time, but for Lali, his childhood was different. When a child witnesses change and lives through that change, big change, like famines, pandemics, and political unrest and war, the effects can often have a dramatic influence on who they become and the way in which they navigate through life. Lali was 10 years old when he experienced and witnessed famine, born in a land that time forgot, the geographical heartbeat of central India. A peepal tree stands proud, and below this tree is where Lali was born. Born into a Hindu family, a Brahmin family, he would listen to the customs and chants of his Sanskrit Hindu faith, whilst listening to tales of slavery and bravery and the courage of his grandparents, leaders of the peasant revolt and tribal revolt in 1857, the first war of independence, to win back their lands from the British Raj and the East India Company. At the time, his land was filled and abundant with crops, but for the distribution of food by the British and the lack of rain, the land became dry and starved of food. People became hungry. And to save his family and find work, he traveled to the next village. And on he went. He traveled to other villages, and he saw the same desperation until finally he became recruited with his thumbprint. And from that thumbprint, it unlocked a whole future of his. I had the good fortune in 2015 of traveling back to the birthplace of Lali Maharaj. I stood below the peepal tree where he was born. I reconnected with our long lost family. These are pictures of the landscape in the region. In many respects, the landscape was no different to what Lali had left behind 120 years ago. Central India, the heartbeat of India. Our partners, the COVID-19 pandemic, pushed the project team to adopt a new approach to shape and share this story. We partnered with a multidisciplinary team of organizations from all over the world to bring this complex period of history to life. the Heritage Fund, a government organisation, the first time in history, the Arts Council of England, the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew. We partners with the National Archives, with a technology company, with the Mela Partnership to present the work at festivals throughout the country, with the Fiji Museum, with the Mozilla Festival in California, who are part of a Firefox browser, and with ourselves, of course. I'm just conscious of time, so I've just got a few minutes. I might just skip this video if that's okay with you all, and move on to the next. But if you're interested in seeing anything, any of our visuals, please log on to girmit.world. Girmit.world is where all of this information sits. 2020 marks the, let's move on from that. Now, 2021 is a very special year in terms of Girmit history. It marks the 10th anniversary of the records of the indentured labour, which was submitted a decade ago and recommended for the Memory of the World Register by UNESCO. So it's really important, I think, for us to be thinking about how we move forward after this two-day conference. And I think really making connections with UNESCO is really, really important. I'll move on very quickly. Creative outputs. Our metrics identify the need and desire to find different ways to tell the same story through different lenses. Each aspect tells a story of Girmit. Digital aspects that we created, VR films, workshops, a graphic novel, oral histories, a plug and play educational toolkit, and wraparound activities like the creating of sonic sounds. There's so many different aspects to this project. I just wanted to put together this collage. In the top left-hand corner is the 360 VR film. In the middle of the film, you can see the port of Calcutta. With headsets, you can immerse yourself into that world where Girmitiya has departed from. In the bottom right-hand corner, you can see our the graphic novel itself. Just going to move on to the next slide. 250,000 people have been engaged with the project so far for the last 18 months. We have an international age group of 12 to 75. We've reached 35 countries, and we've directly influenced a kind of counter narrative about heritage. We've worked across 12 time zones and 4 continents. We've launched Girmit.world as a hub. We've achieved 7 awards through the process, and we've presented the work at a premiere in Amsterdam, a virtual festival. 95% of the people who visit the site like it. 25 people are in the creative team. We've presented the work at 15 international festivals, and 85% people come back again. And this is only the beginning. We've really got 3 ambitions that we'd like to achieve: to increase and reach the audience of the Girmit experience, to work with and alongside organizations such as the India Foundation, government departments and institutions, and with high commissions and embassies. And finally, to introduce art and technology to new audiences, to the Girmit story. I just really wanted to finish on saying that the story of Lali Maharaj is, sorry, I'm just gonna turn this thing off. Just wanted to finish by literally just saying, thank you for your time and your patience. And the story of the Girmit experience and Lali Maharaj's story is a universal story. We all have a foundation story that reminds us of our own humanity and our own purpose. Please do get in touch if aspects of my project have touched you, or if you would like more information, or if you'd simply like to connect and partner with us. Our door will always be open, and let's not allow this time to pass, and let's grasp the momentum and keep up the momentum, because much of the work, it's about changing the language and perceptions. And our Girmitiyas were modern day superheroes. They fought adversity, they created something from nothing, and they remained connected to their Janmabhoomi. And just final sentence I wanted to say, I know I'm over time. The Girmitiyas and their answers have been forgotten for too long. It's now time to welcome them home. Namaskar and thank you.
Thank you, sir, for such a beautiful presentation and for taking us through a very personal journey of your own discovery of your ancestors and of Fiji. I would recommend maybe if you could put the website that you were talking about, you can maybe put it on the chat box. For anyone who's interested, they can visit it directly. We'll move on to our next speaker, Mr. Daljit Maharaj. And incidentally, he's from Fiji. Since we were just talking about Fiji earlier, he's from Fiji. Mr. Maharaj is a third generation descendant of a Girmitiya. In 2017, he visited India under the KIP, the No India program. He is a devoted religious follower of Hinduism and a volunteer towards humanity and service. He holds a master's degree in professional accounting and currently works as a chief financial officer in a group entity. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Shreya. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Okay, just allow me time to share my screen.
We can see the screen, sir.
Oh, sorry, I've shared the wrong screen. Hold on. Thank you. Bula Ram Ram Namaste to all dear friends, delegates and officials of India Foundation, the High Commission of India to Fiji, the Director of CSSV, brothers and sisters connecting live from around the globe. It is a pleasure for me to represent my fellow Fijians and Fiji Indians during this Girmitiya Conference 2021 visually. It has been nice to hear from previous speakers. Fiji is a unique diaspora homeland for many Indians, and the voices from here will resemble in India and everywhere Indians live. We must thank the technology which has connected all Girmitiyas of Indian origin. The distance isn't a barrier to share our stories. We may live far from each other, but we have a lot in common. In my presentation, I'll be talking about voices from Girmitiya diaspora. In brief, I'll be talking about the history of Girmitiya in Fiji, my personal feeling as descendant of a Girmitiya, summary of my life and experience, Fiji Indian culture, languages and their connection to heritage, Girmitiya experiences and their achievements from then till now, some of the challenges being faced by descendants, and my conclusion will be at the end. To begin with, if I had to say when my Girmitiyas came, हमारा नाम दलजीत महाराज है और हमारे पूर्वज इंडिया के रहे। मेरा नाम दलजीत महाराज है और मेरे पूर्वज भारत से। My name is Daljit Maharaj and my ancestors hail from India. Now that multilingual introduction in itself shows how diverse we Girmitiyas are. My great-grandparents came to Fiji from India under British rule to early 1900s. While Fiji was hugely different to their Indian homeland, they managed to survive the Indenture, and with dim hopes and means of retaining, they adopted Fiji as their new home. Up to year 2000, our family continued working in sugarcane farms, but due to farmland lease expiring, our family had no option but to relocate from family land in Lambasa, Fiji. Similar challenges were faced by many Fiji Indian families when their land was taken back, and they felt like a disparate community yet again. This happened mainly between year 1998 to 2003. We had to start from scratch, but the hope was never lost as we are always reminded of our resilient Girmitiyas. Through education and each other's support, our family is stable now. As Shreya said, that introductory about me, that's covered in there. In 2017, when I visited India, I was able to meet for the first time other diaspora fellow people from Indian origin from South Africa, Mauritius, Guyana, Trinidad, and Suriname. And from then I started to have more of the feel of how we Indians were not just only in Fiji, but also around the globe. The Leonidas was the first of 87 ships that transported over 60,000 Indian laborers to Fiji between 1879 and 1960. That included Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. Currently in Fiji, we have got, we are 1/3 of the population, around 340,000. And from them, 27.9% are Hindus and 6.3% are Muslims, and Sikhs and other communities are a minority. This year, despite social and religious obstacles, thousands of Hindus, both upper and lower caste, immigrated to the colonies because of the economic condition in their recruiting area. And this year marks the 142nd anniversary of Girmit, a term derived from English word work agreement. A laborer immigrating under the agreement of Girmit was a Girmitiya, or we can say Jahaji Bhai. In this slide, you can see the articles, how the life wasn't that easy for those who were staying in Fiji at that time. The Girmit ladies, our ancestors working hard in the cane field. Fiji Indian culture and languages and their connection to our heritage. When our ancestors came in Fiji, they built temples, churches, mosques, gurdwaras, and other ethnic community halls to accommodate large gatherings, such as weddings, prayer sessions, and etc. Even though Girmitians came from different states of India, one thing that connected them was the language, Hindi. Not all were fluent in Hindi, as it was mostly spoken by North Indians, but as years passed, Hindi has become mother language of most in Fiji. Mixing languages and dialects with the borrowings from English and Fijian gave birth to a new and unique language, Hindi Bath or Fiji Hindi, most common conventional Hindi used by Fiji Indian across the globe, even in New Zealand, Australia, America, US, people they talk in Fiji Hindi. 14 September is always marked as the Hindi Divas, which is also proudly celebrated in Fiji, and it has been always organized in conjunction with the High Commission of Fiji, India to Fiji, with the USP and other stakeholders such as Fiji Hindu Society, Hindi Parishad of Fiji, and other Hindu religious bodies. And we are proud to say that if this pandemic would not have been there, we would have been organizing we would be hosting rather the International Hindi Conference in Fiji. Far away from India, it makes us proud that Fiji is still upholding its Hindi language and other state languages such as Gujarati, Punjabi, Tamil, Telugu, Urdu, Bhojpuri, and many more. It is the belief that sanskar of Bharat should never be lost. हमारी पहचान हमारी संस्कार से होती है. If I had to speak, I would have spoken in Hindi for this presentation, but we have been speaking in English. And up till now, we, the 4th to 6th descendants, are still reciting our holy books written in Indian languages such as Ramayana, Gita, Quran, Guru Granth Sahib, chanting of mantras, seva, doing jap, and all other aspects of Indian way of life, irrespective of caste, race, and color. All festivals in Fiji are celebrated with oneness, from Holi, Ramnavami, Baisakhi, Ganesh Utsav, Navratri, Diwali, Eid, or even Christmas. There is always a unity and everyone look forward to each other's festival and exchange of gifts. Here you can see in the slide some of the functions that were held by our Fiji Hindu Society. The youths are presenting reciting, children are reciting mantras, there's dance, there's a drama, and not only the Indian culture is just been taken by the Indian community, but you can see in this picture, they are the natives girls who are who perform the dance. And it shows how our Indian culture has taken by the natives. And if time permits, I'll be sharing 2 minutes video if there's time. Share.
Yes, sir, you may do that.
Thank you. Thank you. With faith in hands, Fiji Girmitias chose on the destiny and the brighter future of their next generation. So they work hard day and night. Words may not define on their efforts and works since their arrival to Fiji. What we see now in Fiji is the result of their sacrifices by our ancestors, Girmitias or Jahajis, that we are having a hefty and better life. It is the debt that cannot and never be repaid. But events and conferences like this will always provide opportunities to reconnect with the rich language and cultural legacies that they have left for us to pursue and flourish. Indeed, when I'm saying this, I'm getting goosebumps because when we are in Fiji now, we don't know the hardship. We have not been through the hardship, but they are the only ones who showed us where we are today. You can see this land, barren land, and the sugarcane field. The train is there now. The harvester is there. So a lot more has changed. Yet most Girmitias were not schooled. Yet they ensured their children and future generation get formal education in order to make learned choices and contribute to global progressive culturally, socially, politically, and economically. They have worked hard and made a lot of sacrifices with almost zero resources to set up the most well-established educational institutes in the country. Since the times of Girmitias, we have many schools, colleges, hospitals, and ashrams or centers run by ethnic communities, including Arya Samaj schools, University of Fiji, Guru Nanak School, TSI Sangam School, and their nursing college, Sanatan Dharm schools, Gujarat Education of Fiji, Muslim College, Vivekanand Technical Center, SPC, Fiji Sevasram Sangha, Ram Krishna Mission, and Sai Prema Foundation, the free medical hospital under the name of Sanjeevani Hospital. These all are not just benefited by the Indian descendants, but are for all, even the Ethiopians and all any other caste and religion people are attending to these schools. And these were built by those who are not benefiting, but their future generation. We are the ones benefiting from it. On the national economic front today, almost all major businesses in the country are run and managed by the Fiji Indian communities. Many of the descendants have now joined the civil force, army, police, judicial law, white and blue collar jobs, academic, media, politics, and so on. The field of achievement of the Indians in Fiji have excelled. Pre and post Fiji independence, Fiji Indians have participated equally in general elections, and many got elected as MPs. A Girmit descendant, Honorable Mr. Mahendra Chaudhary, was also appointed as the first Indian Prime Minister in Fiji in the year 1999 to 2000. Some even got opportunity to migrate to other countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, USA, Europe, yet they regard Fiji as their motherland and pay tribute to it as well. Currently, Fiji Indians make just over 1/3 of total Fiji's population. Some of the great achievements by descendants, example of the artists and sportsmen, Shri Sumit Tapu is a Bollywood singer and director of Sai Prema Foundation and Tapu's group. Shri Roy Krishna, legendary soccer player, also played in Indian Super League match in 2020, and globally renowned golfer Shri Vijay Singh. Some of the challenges that are being faced now, despite the hard work and with great vision of success by the Girmitias, there are some Fiji Indian families who are still struggling and competing for a better life. While half of them would be victim of the land issue, others may simply benefit from basic education to improve their standard of living. Some challenges faced by Fiji Indians include living in informal sectors, problems faced by current COVID-19 pandemic crisis and unemployment issues, urbanization of the youth population with lack of interest in pursuing families' sugarcane farming legacy, affordability towards standard housing, insecurity due to political upheaval. As you may know, Fiji experienced 3 coups between 1987 to 2006, and our first speaker, she also mentioned about this, and the question was also asked. Challenges with retaining culture, language, and heritage. In this fast-paced life, where cost of living is high and so everyone works to make ends meet, it is a challenge to retain language and culture, to ensure our Sanskriti and our sanskars are preserved and passed down to the next generation rightfully. What happens here is in these challenges, what I have mentioned in this point is their expenses, their cost of living, and the parents, they don't have the time to give the sanskar and that values to their kids. They have all the gadgets. It's so sad that some of the families, they have not passing down the Sanskriti and sanskar to their children. Access to education is a challenge in this COVID-19 situation, where visual platform is not that reliable to keep track of progress. Some families don't have access to technology. There is a rising trend in the lack of interest from youth parents, children, and youths in reading, writing, and speaking Hindi. Our learning cultural activities like Indian dance, music. More convenience is seen in using English in this fast-paced living. Before I end, I wish to suggest to the organizing committee that this amazing and uniting platform can be leveraged for an ongoing forum of Indian diaspora communities, representatives, where we can work together in tackling any common challenges and identifying opportunities for a stronger global Girmitiya community. There might be opportunities for the government of India, the Ministry of External Affairs, to assist the global Girmitiyas directly or indirectly, because we are people of Indian origin. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the great effort put in by the director, Shri Santosh Mishraji, and his team at SVCC, High Commission of India to Fiji. Great heartily thanking the High Commissioner and the members of Indian Foundation from India and the Ministry of External Affairs. Also, thanks to all my dear brothers and sisters who joined visually to participate, my co-speakers, and special thanks to Ms. Shreya. Lastly, to each and everyone joining live, I appreciate your valuable time in listening to me. Shreya, if I have got time, can I just share that small video?
Yes, so we have about a minute maybe, so then we can have some questions.
It's just a two minutes video. Let me just stop sharing this.
Sure, sir.
Huh? Thank you, Shreya.
Thank you, sir.
That's my mother singing in one of the Girmitiya program that was held in early this year. And from Fiji, Nisambula Binaka, Dhanyavad Mode.
Okay, thank you for sharing such a personal video with us. I'm sure our audience really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Shreya. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. We'll open the floor now for any questions. I already see one hand raised. So if Ms. Savi Veerapan can unmute herself.
Mr. Veerapan, you need to unmute.
She needs to unmute.
Good morning to everybody. It's morning in South Africa.
Sure, ma'am.
My name is Savi, short for Savitri, and of South Indian origin, right? I just want to thank the speakers. What beautiful presentations, and I regret I joined this quite late. I just joined at the tail end of the last speakers. I got two questions for Anand and Ajay. My ancestors, I did a bit of history, and my findings was a lot from oral history. I couldn't get things in terms of records. And I would like help from both the speakers. The diaspora of Anand's presentation, he got a lot of information on indentured laborers. And I found out a lot of my ancestors came as passenger Indians, and they came via Cape Town. They didn't come as indentured laborers. I was just wondering if the India Foundation or Anand has come across any records regarding that, because I'm finding it very difficult to find records. And that comes now to my second question, Ajay. You know, your story was so wonderful, your experience. It kind of reminded me very much of my own when I was doing the history, and I couldn't find records. I've only got my grandfather's, sorry, not my grandfather, my mother's birth certificate. And that's about all. And I had to go and find aunties and uncles, and some of them are late now. And it took me over 20 years. And I have produced a book on that, discovering heritage, lineage, and South Indian taste, because my ancestors come from Tamil Nadu. From your experience, and especially the British connection, I would like to know, are there any records about ships? Again, passenger Indians, not indentured laborers, but they could have been mixed in one ship. The disrespect, the inhumanities that went on. And, you know, I share that personal experience because we all have, although our ancestors came from India, and we like third, fourth generations and actually dissolved in our cultures now in South Africa and in other parts of the world. But that link to India is so personal. And I would like to know, again, are there any records of ships? My question is coming to both the speakers, both Anand and Ajay. Are there any records regarding passenger Indians? Thank you so much. And thanks again for the beautiful presentations. Thanks.
Mr. Ajay, would you like to go first?
Thank you, Shreya. Savitriji, lovely to meet you, and you know, great to connect with South Africa. I'll be really, really brief. There is a colleague on this forum at the moment, Dr. Satish Rai, who will be speaking shortly, who has been my source of inspiration. I didn't mention him in my speech, but he is currently in Sydney. And for those of you who can see the screen, you know, we should really reach out to him. I don't want to overwhelm you, Satish, but Satish and I met when I was 10 years old in London, and he's originally from Fiji, and he's a what I call a Girmit he helped me find the village, not just me, but many, he's connected to India. So as a practical piece of advice, I would say, head for Satish. But again, I don't want to overwhelm you. But the other part of your question, I live 10 minutes walk from two really important institutions, the National Archives in London, which have 1,000 years of British history archives. So each time the colonies were made independent, all of those boxes, some didn't make it back to London. Some were destroyed for obvious reasons. But I've just been spending quite a lot of time in the National Archives. So that's a really good source of reference. And the other point I wanted to make was about the other institution, which is the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew. Our starting point has to be why our parents went in the first place. Now, there's a missing piece of information here. There are lots of scattered institutions, the City of London, the Lloyd's Register, which is the International Shipping Register, archives in each of our respective countries that we live in. Very few archives in Delhi, from my own experience. More of those archives, if anything good the British did, and I'm speaking as a sort of, I think the only person from, the UK on this forum currently, if anything good they did, they were meticulous at keeping records, which actually kind of throws back in your face. Those records will exist, and they do exist. I think part of my points in my conclusion was that if there are three things that we can do, one of those things should be to come together and create a really strong research task force, because capacity is the issue. Savitri, you're not going to necessarily be able to just jump on a plane overnight and come to Glasgow or London, and neither am I to, Durban or Sydney or Delhi. But if we can find these young, smart, crack force, highly intelligent Indian researchers that have a kind of a clear objective of bringing all these archives into one place and making them available by some kind of portal, that would really be a step up. I hope that helps.
Right.
Mr. Anand, would you have something to add?
Okay, thank you, Shreya, and I'm sure Shreya is juggling for time. So for Akka Savi Virapan, to answer your question, it'll be too long for me to do, but I think this is a message for everyone. If you want to know anything about the indenture and history of indenture and the ship list, etc., please email me. I'll give you my email and I can try to assist you. Email me on jayraj@yahoo.com. Spell that name Jayraj correctly as it's on the screen. It's JAYRAJH@yahoo.com, and I'll try to assist you all in tracing your ancestry. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of our speakers. A lot of the presentations very personal, and I think we've taken so much away from that. We'll move on to our next session, making of the Girmit Indentured Diaspora. I'll call upon my colleague, Mr. Siddharth, to moderate the session.
Good afternoon, everyone. The theme of this particular session is making of the Girmit Indentured Diaspora. In this session, we have three speakers. The first speaker is Ambassador Virendra Gupta. Ambassador Virendra Gupta retired as a diplomat in 2016 after completing 37 years of service in the Indian Foreign Service. He served as India's High Commissioner in Tanzania, Trinidad, and Tobago, and finally in South Africa also. I now request Ambassador Virendra Gupta ji to please speak.
Well, thank you very much, Siddharth. First of all, I'd like to congratulate India Foundation for having organized such a wonderful seminar, putting together the whole galaxy of very distinguished experts, people who have first-hand experience of how the Girmit diaspora has organized itself. And I really feel very privileged to having participating in this forum. Now, first of all, I think I should mention that I represent Antarashtriya Sahyog Parishad, which is a pioneer organization in India. It started about 6 decades ago in connecting with the Indian diaspora and in expanding our outreach with the Indian diaspora. Today, there are many organizations which take up this issue, But at the time when Antarashtriya Sahayog Parishad started doing it, it was a lone voice. And our relationship with the diaspora and vice versa wasn't what it is today. As we all know, I mean, this has evolved over a period of time, giving confidence, greater confidence on both sides in wanting to connect. Now, basically, we have three distinct aspects of diaspora. The diaspora in the Gulf, which is about 10 million, the workers. The tendency in India is to put them at the bottom of the heap. But actually, if you measure in terms of the remittances and what they do for the country, I think I would place them at the top. Then you have the diaspora in the developed countries, what's called the dollar diaspora. And they give us a sense of pride and achievement, because the diaspora there distinguishes itself in terms of occupying senior positions in management. You count so many top people in the corporate sector abroad in America and elsewhere who are of Indian origin, and the IT sector. It is said that in great IT companies of America, it's either owned by the Indians, or about 30-40% people who are working there are of Indians. So I think it is, but how much of actual benefit do they bring for India? It remains to be seen. We've been trying to get them to bring investments into India, bring technology transfer, but I think it is very largely in the domain of our wanting to try. We are yet to see concrete results in that. And the third aspect of the third tier of the diaspora, which is the Girmitiya diaspora, people who went out as indentured labor. Now, in terms of stratifying them, in terms of putting them in a category, I would, when it comes to emotional attachment, when it comes to that warm sentiment and feeling for India, I think the Girmitiya diaspora is unmatched, and I would place the Girmitiya diaspora at the top of the heap in terms of and mind you, they've all been living quite far away. Caribbean is very far away, and yet over the last nearly 170, 150 years, they have maintained a very strong connection. They've maintained, if not physical connection, they maintain a very strong emotional and cultural connection. Now, just to give a little background, I think I'm sorry to have missed the previous presentations, so I wouldn't go into too many facts, because I'm sure all of that must have been covered already. But we all know that is the abolition of slavery, which triggered the dispatch of so many indentured workers from India. And I use the word dispatch very deliberately, because even though they are supposed to have gone under an agreement, so it is of their own volition, a voluntary exercise, but I think it is far from that. And in most cases, these workers who were illiterate, they didn't understand the terms of the agreement, which were heavily weighted against them. And in any case, the colonial administration had certain targets to achieve. So the colonial administration, the district headquarters, the state headquarters, state governments were asked to comply with certain numbers, provide certain numbers for onward shipment from Calcutta or whatever was the port. Now, it could be said that they were escaping poverty and deprivation in India. In some cases, it could have been true, but in large measure, because it was not a voluntary exercise. So I think it is really academic. Then they come on to the ships which ferried them from India to the plantations in distant lands. and the ship journey was extremely harsh. Many perished in this sea journey. They were thrown overboard. They were subject to very hard work. So the kind of life that they were to embrace upon reaching the plantations, in a sense, it started in the ships itself. And because of hardship and deprivation, there was a sense of brotherhood. There was a sense of solidarity which developed, and which is why these Girmitis also called Jahaji Bhais. And I think this helped in creating a new identity, which submerged all other distinctions. After arriving in their new homes, plantations, they were subject to very, very difficult working conditions, long working hours. There were hardly any opportunity for them to go back, even if they did not find the working conditions very conducive, because then in that case, they would forfeit all the allowances and everything. Now, what held them together was, their religion. And it is commonly said that they stuck to their Ramayana and Hanuman Chalisa. And you would still find, in fact, in many of these countries, most people remember Hanuman Chalisa by heart. They may not understand what is written in Hanuman Chalisa, but they follow it, and they are passionately committed to it. Now, what happened because of this very strong religious bonds, and the fact that their entire socialization was governed by that, and the religion became a very important factor for them to endure those hardships. So this glue brought the co-religionists together in a very strong sense. The point that I'm trying to make is that let's take about the Hindus. If you talk about the Hindus, the caste distinctions, they were very conscious of their Hindu identity in the Girmit countries, but their caste distinctions largely disappeared, which was not the case when they left India. In India, the caste distinctions were very, very alive at the time when they left India, but finding themselves in a new environment where religion became a very strong glue for them to hold on together and for them to endure the injustices and deprivation and the hardship, they almost forgot the caste distinctions. And I saw that play out when I was in Trinidad. In fact, most Hindus were not conscious of their castes. They're conscious about the fact that they were Hindus. And there was very little interaction between the Hindus and the Muslims. I'm talking about the Indian Muslims and those who had converted to Christianity. So these were three very, very distinct groups. Now, insofar as the Hindus are concerned, the caste distinctions disappeared to such an extent that, for the priesthood was not limited to Brahmins alone. Anybody from any caste, from any background. In fact, firstly, most people are not aware of their caste. Anybody could do a course in Panditai. If you did a course in Panditai, you were qualified to become a priest, and you could be positioned in a temple and undertake all the rituals for the Hindu families. So I think this was a very remarkable feature, particularly when you transpose it what's happening in India. In India, there is so much of consciousness about the caste in terms of our social dynamics, in terms of our political dynamics. And I think this is something to be learned. Is there a way of, in diluting our caste consciousness? So when you see that the religious fulcrum for all social activities in the early days, and I think that pretty much continues. If you went into a Girmit country, countries where there are very large Girmit populations, Caribbean, Guyana, Mauritius, Trinidad, then you have Fiji and Mauritius. These 5 countries, incidentally, large Girmit population, which constitute roughly 50% of the country's population. So these countries are very, very special insofar as India is concerned. Reunion has a very large Girmit population. Guadeloupe in Caribbean. Suriname has very large population. And apart from these countries, South Africa, of course, which is very strongly represented in our conference today. Malaysia also has a very large Girmit population. So I think you find that these religious institutions, in the sense that all their social activities getting together, and what I said again is that because of that there is very little interaction. You don't find any Indian association. You would find associations along the religious lines in whatever countries you're looking at. Now, because these people came at a time and they found the conditions very, very harsh, almost akin to a siege mentality. They had to hold on to something. So they held on to their religion, and they held on to their culture. They held on to their customs and values. Now, many customs you find and many rituals you find which they brought with them are no longer very extensively followed in India. Food, for instance, in Trinidad, what's called the roti has a very distinct the kind of Indian food which was prevalent amongst the poorer people in UP and Bihar. And in terms of spices, they would only know the use of haldi, which is turmeric, the red chilies, and salt. They did not have access to sophisticated spices. So even today, their food, and I don't know, Trinidad is a very rich country, in fact, the richest in the Caribbean, with very high per capita income, and Indians are doing very well. Indians could have access to anything that they want to ask, but they remain, very much attached to the kind of Indian food that they brought, which is called Indian roti. So if you, I heard from so many people that when they go to London, when they come to India, they like different kind of food which is offered in Indian restaurants or in India, but after a few meals they have a very strong craving to go back to the roti, the kind of food which is, and it's the same food which is eaten by a poor Trinidadian or a very rich Trinidadian. So I think this customs and rituals now it could be very outward.
But request you to conclude in 15.
Okay, all right. Also, you find that in terms of language, because language is a vehicle for expressing your culture, and therefore, in different measure, the diaspora communities have done a lot in terms of preserving the language and propagating it. Last point that I'd like to make is that we very often talk about India's soft power, and in terms of what the government agencies can do in various countries. And I think it should be right to say that the role of Indian diaspora and the hundreds and thousands of Indian cultural academies, performing art academies, various schools for imparting training in culture, in dance and Indian music, that role of the Indian community, the Indian diaspora community, particularly in the countries where there is large Girmit population, has not been fully recognized. So when I was in the ICCR, in fact, we tried to institutionalize the contribution made by prominent diaspora people in the field of dance and music. And I think this is something that we have to understand, that we have to, at the government level, only supplement the effort of the community. And if we did that, our culture would do very well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your insightful comments. May I now request Mr. Ruben Govricham. Dr. Govricham has published books on shifting bonds, political integration, homemaking, and new perspectives in the Indian diaspora as well as a few scholarly papers about the Hindustani community in Suriname and Netherlands. So may I now request Professor Ruben to please speak. Unmute, sir. First, unmute yourself. Yes, please go ahead, sir.
Very good speech by Mr. Virendra. I would like to know whether I'm coming from Malaysia. My father was born in Malaysia, and then my grandfather, he came to Malaysia, same as and he mentioned about we are the third majority race in Malaysia. So and Deepavali is given a public holiday in Malaysia. We talk very much about the Indians in that diaspora, and this is the first forum where I could see that we could connect with the other side of the world.
Questions at the end, sir. Sir, we will take questions at the end.
Just want to know, will the sentiments which we share now, what about the future generation? Will they have the same attachment, or do they have any sort of media where we can
We'll be taking the question answers at the end, sir. Let all three speakers speak.
Yeah.
May I request Professor Ruben to please go ahead?
That's it. Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to congratulate the organizers of this Girmitiya conference and inviting me to have this small talk. I'm very honored with that. The second remark I would like to make is that my talk is a bit different from what you generally are used to hear. My talk is based on a book I'm finishing on the Girmitiya peasants. What is left out in the scholarly research about Girmitiyas is that the first generation of laborers who went to plantation colonies overseas, they have been turned into peasants, small agriculturalists. And after that stage, their descendants went to urban areas and they formed a national community. That middle section between being plantation laborers and urban dwellers, so being peasants, that section is totally under-researched. So my book is about a comparison of the peasantry in these societies, comparing Suriname, Guyana, Fiji, and Mauritius. I took only 4 countries because these countries are very specific, and a comparison may reveal some new insights. And now the making of the Girmitiya diaspora. As you know, the diaspora, every diaspora is based on 2 preconditions. One is that people establish an ethnic community, and the other is that people acknowledge a homeland. And that homeland is, in this case, India. The homeland may be a personal homeland. So if you're talking about the first generation, and you're talking about a personal homeland, but it can be also a parental and an ancestral homeland. We know the example of the Jewish communities all over the world. They refer to Israel as their homeland, but that homeland was a homeland ages ago, but still it operates like that. These days, the homeland has been differentiated. I will come to that at the end of my speech because the homeland issue is a bit complicated. I will focus in my reading on 3 questions. What were the distinguishing characteristics of the Girmitiyas? How did the ethnic communities originate, and how did the Girmitiya diaspora evolve over time? So those are three questions which capture, I think, the evolution of the diaspora. We know that between 1835 and 1920, about 1.3 million people emigrated from British India to overseas plantation colonies. The largest immigrant communities were Mauritius, with about 450,000 immigrants, and former British Guyana, which received 239,000 people, including women and children. About half of the 1.3 million immigrants went to the Caribbean, and the other half went to territories in South and East Africa and the Pacific. The major receiving communities or societies were Mauritius, British Guyana, Natal, Trinidad, Reunion, Fiji, Guadeloupe, Kenya and Uganda, Jamaica, Suriname, Martinique, and a few smaller societies. And the largest supplier of these immigrants was the north of British India. Labor recruiters in the north of British India focused on individuals who were in search of employment either in rural areas or in the cities, whereas recruitment in the south was carried out by mostly ex-indentured laborers who were sent to mobilize laborers in the villages and in their own families. This mode of recruitment, known as the Kangani system, accounts for a greater degree of homogeneity in terms of families, caste, religion, language, and culture. Mauritius serves as a prime example of the Kangani mode of recruitment. Because of the relatively small distance between Mauritius and India, laborers easily returned home and were subsequently re-indentured. This is called circular migration, and it was practically absent in Caribbean societies because of the large distance. The internal diversity of Indian population in Mauritius was enhanced by the immigration of free Indians such as Gujaratis and Punjabis, who settled as traders and merchants, specifically in those societies in the Pacific. The only difference consistently found in all countries were those along a religious line, especially between Hindus and Muslims. The size of the emigration population erroneously suggests that these people left their home society for good. That is only partly true. A significant proportion of these migrants returned to British India. That proportion varied with the mode of recruitment, with circular migration leading to a higher proportion of returning migrants, but also a higher proportion of people leaving for a new destination country. At no point in history were the size of the Indian immigrant population even close to the total number of those who had emigrated. For example, British Guyana received 239,000 people, but at no point in time during the 80-year of indentured period, there were more than 100,000 Indians present in the country. The second question concerns the formation of an ethnic community. The answers to this question are not always clearly defined, as in some societies, such as Jamaica and Martinique, the British Indians were largely assimilated into the host population. Where an ethnic community was established successfully, three clear stages to its establishment can be observed. The first stage consists of nascent labor communities on the plantations. The laborers were diverse in terms of regional origin, religion, and cultural practices and traditions, and yet according to all reports, it appears that they mixed to a high degree, except for North and South Indians, who formed two distinct communities that differed in appearance, religion, language, and live culture. Suriname was one of the few countries who had only laborers from Northeast India, so the division between North and South Indians was not an issue. The recycling of laborers during the indentured period played an important role in the retention of Indian culture in most societies. The second stage of the formation of an ethnic community occurred in the period after indentured had been served. During this stage, the British Indians had the opportunity to settle down as peasants. they established peasant communities, and these communities were relatively stable because there was no recycling of labor as on the plantations. The survival of the peasant communities, and that's a very crucial point, if you want to establish a long-lasting community, that depended on three conditions. One is the formation of families. The other was the access to land, in fact, the economic base of the community. And the third was the institutionalization of the culture. The formation of families depended very much on the proportion of women who migrated. During Indentured, the British Indian colonial government had set the ratio at 40 women for every 100 men. Most societies received this proportion. Also, the ratio was least favorable for Suriname, where for every 100 men, 27 women were received. Mauritius had the most favorable ratio of men to women, with over 40 women for every 100 men. In the case of Mauritius, there was also the possibility of partners being brought in from British India. Family formation was important for the natural growth of the population and for the survival of the peasant farm. Women were a minority in all societies, but despite the variations in proportions of women across the plantation societies, the number of and the size of the families grew. The peasants settled on plots of land which were sometimes made available by the planters and sometimes provided on lease terms by the local governments. In Suriname, access to land was practically unlimited as plantations went bankrupt and land became available. The other extreme was Fiji, where access to land was practically monopolized by the native Fijians, European planters, and the government. While in most plantation economies, sugar remained the main product, gradually British Indian peasants switched to rice production. In Suriname, for example, a highly specialized rice-producing peasant community emerged, and in Guyana, peasants specialized in the production of both sugar and rice. In Mauritius, Fiji, and Guyana, descendants of British Indians still work on the plantations as laborers and as peasants on part-time or full-time leased plots. Despite the variations in conditions across the Girmitiya diaspora, a British Indian ethnic community developed in practically all countries. The formation of the ethnic peasant community involved the increase in number of families, the consolidation of the economic base, the development of internal networks, the establishment of religious institutions and community festivities, and the maintenance of the language, of ethnic food, and of a familiar lived culture. In this way, the peasant community was able to integrate into the newly adopted homeland. At the same time, the peasant community appeared to be a crucial link in the development of the Girmitiya diaspora. The peasants had established an increasing number of social cultural organizations, including religious institutions and sport clubs. The influence of British India was clearly present, both directly and indirectly, in the culture of the Indians. This cultural influence was particularly evident in the crops grown, the food, the language, the celebrations, the rituals, the music, the dances, the religions, and the stories. Such development among the ethnic groups amounted to a form of Indian cultural homemaking. It was also expressed in architecture, mosques and temples, religious gatherings, public festivals, street names, and parades. The third stage of the formation of the community coincided with the evolution of it. It started when descendants of the British Indians left agriculture and either resorted to entrepreneurship or found employment in white-collar jobs, mostly in the government sector. This shift occurred predominantly after the Second World War. It was a movement in which the descendants rose above the agricultural sector and began to exert more influence at the national level in their societies. This growing influence could already be witnessed in the trade unions or agricultural organizations that acted against the planters or the government. Later, this movement led to the establishment of ethnic political parties that often represented the interests of the ethnic community. The ethnic group expanded further with the establishment of additional institutions and the consolidation of relations with India. In urban areas, Indians expanded and increased the number of institutions that became the pillars of community life. These included the establishment of Hindu and Muslim schools, temples and mosques, radio stations, cinema, orphanages, and cemeteries, and the overall proliferation of community life. It constituted a further expansion of homemaking in the urban area. The cinemas showing Bollywood movies are a special and highly underestimated institution in the story of the cohesion of the ethnic community and the Indian diaspora. These films became part of the lift culture as they were shown regularly, daily or weekly, in various societies. The films became mechanisms for disseminating fashion, stories, film heroes, and especially music and song. The impact of Indian cinema was also reflected in the various musical groups that performed Bollywood songs and music at nautas and on daily radio and television broadcasts. The Bollywood film just contributed to the preservation of Hindi, catering to several kinds of ethnic taste while maintaining contact with an advertised India. Bollywood actors and singers used to visit the Girmitiya diaspora along with religious gurus and scholars. The Indian embassies were also of great importance in maintaining a connection with India. Embassies act as mediators of politicians and tourists visiting India. They offer scholarships for study and also facilitated the visits of religious scholars, Bollywood artists, politicians, and entrepreneurs. In addition, embassies offer Hindi lessons, musical instrument classes, classical dancing courses, and courses in preparation of Indian dishes. At public festivals such as Diwali celebrations, officials from the Indian embassy are present, and in most societies, representatives of the Indian government and the Indian business community are present at official gatherings. While it's true that the Indian community gradually lost its agrarian character due to migration to the urban areas, it retained the bonding with India that is still discernible apart from Bollywood and the role of the Indian embassy in the use of Hindi as the official community language, the reference to Bharat Mata as the ancestral homeland, and the maintaining of close contact with the Indian embassies and Bollywood institutions. The presence of India in the life of the descendants of the Girmitiyas had greatly strengthened the cohesion of the ethnic community. Cultural considerations around marriage partners, language, religion, ethnic food, fashion, Bollywood, and taste in various fields have thus been preserved. India remained a cultural source and reference and is interwoven into the daily life of the diaspora Indians. As a result of multiple changes, the character of the ethnic community changed. Ethnic institutions remained largely intact. Community life expanded, new institutions were established, but at the same time, the British Indian community absorbed elements from other ethnic groups. In Mauritius and Guyana, for example, the Indian community language gradually was displaced by English or Creole. In addition to the existing divisions between religious groups, new divisions arose, such as those between urban and rural groups, or between westernized and traditional Indians. Some mixing also occurred due to regular contact with other ethnic groups and Western education. In most societies, members of the ethnic community migrated to their colonial motherland or to another Western society. Indo-Fijians, for example, moved to Australia and the US, while Indo-Guyanese migrated to the UK, the US, and Canada. Multiple homelands have thus been developed, including India, the former plantation societies, and the present country of residence. Paradoxically, it was particularly when the ethnic community became players on a national stage that ties with India became stronger. This was partly due to the fact that, especially after the Second World War, ethnic parties were established in most countries, an event that had served to heighten the awareness of ethnic issues. Political parties gave the British Indian population national status, which enabled them to promote.
Sorry to interrupt, Professor Ben. We are running out of time. Request you to please continue.
I'm ending. Yeah. Political parties give the British Indian population national status, which enabled them to promote their economic interest, ethnicity, and Indian origin. Politicians from these countries visited India. Embassies were set up. Religious and other scholars from India visited these countries. The Bollywood industry became a major supply chain of culture, and rising prosperity meant that tourism to India also increased. India just became part of the lived culture of the people in the diaspora countries. This could not happen without an ethnic community that contained elements of Indian culture or some variations of those elements. In this way, an active Girmitiya diaspora emerged that remained bonded with India and at times visited the ancestral homeland. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Udain, for this insightful presentation. May I now request Professor Manoranjan Mohanty. Dr. Manoranjan Mohanty is an associate professor at the University of the South Pacific, Fiji. He has authored several papers on the diaspora. So may I now request Dr. Mohanty to please speak for 10 to 15 minutes. Over to you, Dr. Mohanty.
Thank you very much, NC, and thank you, Sri and Sriti, for the good communication and organizing this. I congratulate
Dr. Mohanty, your connection.
First of all, India Foundation, and I sincerely thank the India Foundation for giving me this opportunity to speak on this Girmitiya Conference 2021.
I think because of bad internet connection, we have lost Dr. Mohanty. He will join us soon. Till the time Dr. Mohanty joins back, may I now request if any of the participants have some comments to make or any questions to for the previous two speakers. Any comments by the participants or any questions to the previous two speakers, Professor Udain and yes, please, Mr. Ajay Shah.
Thank you, Siddharth. This is a question for Mr. Gupta. Is Mr. Gupta still online? Essentially, it's the instrument of government. Is again, just thinking, reflecting back on my intervention earlier. I think as a follow-up from this conference, if there is a kind of more strategic thinking about what the outcomes are, because we're familiar with the history. I think that's agreed. We're familiar with what happened, how it happened, where it happened, who it happened to. I think what we're looking to do as a homogeneous global Girmitiya group of people is how can instruments of government work together to ensure these lines of communication are really powerful, how we can maintain them, and how we can turn the emotion into social and economic value. Now, from our research, at least if somebody is researching their Girmit history, they are spending possibly in the region of $5,000 on one trip. Now, if you start to think about the numbers of people of Girmit history around the world, we're looking at 25 or 30 million. If each of those started to think about reconnecting with their village or their homeland, the economic values and the social values are immense. And I'd really like to think about how and what happens post these conversations. I think Mr. Gupta is not here for that. So.
Yes, Dr. Mohanty has joined us back.
Sorry, MC and participants, there was technological hazard,
Yes,
so it was
Dr.
disconnected.
Yes, please go ahead, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. And once again, I congratulate the India Foundation and sincerely thank the India Foundation for giving me this opportunity to speak on this Girmitiya Conference 2021. I would like to say that the High Commissioner of India to Fiji, His Excellency P.S. Karthikeyan, the Director Swami Vivekananda Cultural Center, Mr. Santosh Kumar, and esteemed participants, my topic today as given making of Girmitiya Indentured diaspora. I'll be speaking for in the context of Fiji. In fact, I'm not a descendant of Girmitiya, but an Indian from India, living here in Fiji for long and working on migration and diaspora, and particularly contemporary diaspora. So from that point of view, I was asked to speak. So as the time is very limited, I'll organize my talk to cover 4 or 5 aspects of Girmitiya diaspora. I'll brief, I think earlier speaker from Fiji, Dr. Kamala Lakshmi and Dr. Daljit Maharaj has already given history of Girmitiya, and so I'll not dwell upon in detail, but quickly I'll touch upon the brief background of emergence of Fiji Girmitiyas. And my perspective will be slightly different, focusing particularly on the Girmitiya diaspora formation and contemporary diaspora. So I'll talk also a little bit on plantation life and Girmitiya struggles. I'll talk about the old and new diaspora, which for making the Fiji Girmit diaspora. And I'll also develop a little bit on the changing Girmit diaspora identity in the context of Fiji. And the contemporary diaspora, I'll be speaking on Fiji, formation of Fiji Indian diaspora in making, and some concluding remarks. So as already you know, that under British indentured labor system, between the 1834 and 1917, the migrants went to the British colonies, and Fiji was the late comer to Indian indentured system, and began after 45 years of the first indentured system that started in Mauritius in 1834. And today, already spoken by other, the speakers, today there are at least 5 Girmitiya countries with 30 to 65% of Indian origin population to their total population. Mauritius is having about 65%, Trinidad 46%, Guyana 40%, Suriname 39%, and Fiji has now reduced from 50% to 34% of Indian origin population. So in Fiji, the journey of Girmitiya, as I already said, started when the first ship Leonidas carrying 463 indentured laborers for India, which arrived in Fiji on the May 14, 1879. For efficiency, I think I'll close my video, so it will be better. The indentured labor migration lasted 37 years, and a total 42 ships that made for 87 voyages to Fiji between 1879 and 1916. As we know that officially the indenture contract in Fiji, everywhere ended by 1st January 1920. So majority of immigrants which came from from northern provinces of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar and central India, and a total of 60,553 laborers arrived in Fiji, and 75% of them came from through Calcutta port. And after 1903, then 25% came from South India to Fiji. And having crossed this Kalafani, the immigrants were held in quarantine in the Nukulau Island in Fiji for several weeks. And as Brijlal has covered, about 260 social groups diversified in terms of language, religion, caste, and region, covering about 260 districts of India and the adjacent areas, including Nepal, came to Fiji. So more than, like Trinidad and other countries, about 85% were Hindus, 8% Muslims, and 7% were Christians and other they professed the other religions in Fiji. There was gender imbalance. I think Professor Ruben has already said it was in Fiji context also 4 women to 10 men. So there was gender imbalance everywhere in the Girmitiya period, but here in the Fiji as well. So as elsewhere, if we see, the plantation life was very harsh, and it was very restrictive living conditions. The laborers' economic and social lives in the coolie lands was very harsh. As some authors mentioned, that plantation life was prison-like, and all forms of social violence occurred, particularly Bijay Naidu, his book on social violence during Indentured in Fiji. He mentioned that. And the Girmitiya period, as already you know, that it was marked as a period of struggle, misery, exploitation, suffering, sacrifice, and hope. And a very high degree linguistic diversity existed among the Girmitiyas, and they spoke different languages, as already said, Bhojpuri, Hindi, Punjabi, Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, Malayalam, and Urdu, in particular in Fiji. A unique culture developed during Girmitiya era, and as Brijlal said, the new life fostered a sense of companionship and togetherness that cut across barriers of religion, caste, and place of origin. As we know that one of the very important contribution of Girmitiyas was creation of a casteless society, and the identity, which is coolie identity, which was of great significance. It provided a ground to create a casteless society in Fiji. So the Girmitiyas who completed 5 years of contract became free to return to India. However, upon the end of Girmit period in Fiji, only 25,000 returned to India, and others accepted Fiji as the new homeland and possessed land and became small tenant farmers. Gradually, they transformed from bonded agricultural laborers to small holding tenants and artisans, lower, higher ranking government officials, entrepreneurs, and highly professional in terms of skilled professionals. So Girmitiyas in Fiji formed a distinct Indian diaspora. And as you know that Girmitiyas, when they arrived, they formed the primary migrants, and gradually they transformed into primary Indian diaspora. The Girmit period in Fiji witnessed also free migrants, as already said earlier, that many, like particularly farmers from Punjab and traders and merchants from Gujarat. By 2020, there was a sizable pre-Indian immigrants in Fiji. So with the arrival of Gujarati community, as you know, started the establishment of trade, commerce, and business in Fiji, and the community maintained a close socio-cultural bonding with India and established local business network with ties to India. So majority Punjabi immigrants which arrived after 1920, they mainly from northern provinces of Punjab and were involved in agricultural works in Fiji. So the Indian diaspora emerged in Fiji due to 2 distinct global movements as elsewhere. So first is British indentured labor migration movement, and secondly, the economic migrant movement. And clearly, 3 distinct diaspora categories existed in Fiji. One is, which we are talking about, the Girmit Indentured diaspora. The second is pre-migrant diaspora, covering the Gujaratis and the Punjabis. They formed the Gujarati diaspora and Sikh diaspora with Fijian nationality. And the third category, which Indian expatriate migrants with Indian nationality, like me. So they came directly either from India or from other Pacific Rim metropolitan countries. So these are the three ones. So the three diaspora emerged, and there was a clear-cut old versus new diaspora, which you talked about. The contractual Girmitiyas, they formed an old Indian diaspora in Fiji, whereas the free Indians, they formed the new Indian diaspora. And the nature of bonding with motherland India varied substantially, and from old to new diaspora. And as I already said, and the old diaspora, they had emotional, imaginary connections more, but the free Indian diaspora, in terms of travel, in terms of a connection, was different. So the Girmit old diaspora in Fiji were a very divergent diaspora with very high degree diversity, which existed in terms of religion, in terms of language, in terms of region. So there are sub diasporas within diaspora also emerged, like Tamil diaspora, Telugu diaspora in the linguistic line, Marathi diaspora, and Malayalam diaspora as elsewhere. So this is a common category of diasporas within diaspora emerging everywhere, and including Fiji. So however, over 4 to 5 generations, there has been considerable language loss, especially among the descendants of Girmitiyas of small linguistic groups in Fiji, particularly, say, for example, Malayalam and Kannada. They have almost lost, and there is a language loss. So when you see that during the Girmitiya diaspora, they had different identities. So we have been talking about identities here. There was a clear shifting of Girmit diaspora identity. If we see that throughout the Girmit period and afterwards, the Girmitiya has maintained cultural identities, as already said, through the cultural activities, local folk music, including bhajan, kirtan, lokgit, Ramayana Katha, Ramalila. All these kept Indian culture alive. And particularly the Ramayana and Ramayana Mandalis, which is a very, Ramayana Mandalis, which emerged during 1930s and 1940s in Fiji, played a critical role in binding and engaging Girmit diaspora. So the Girmit diaspora of different caste, creed, language, and religion lived together in the colonial plantations and produced a distinct cultural identity. So over the time, again, as already said by earlier speakers, common lingua franca, which is called the plantation language, which emerged, Fiji Bath. And the plantation Hindi language later became the Fiji Hindi, and which became a distinct identity of Girmit diaspora in Fiji. So pre-Girmitiyas, after completing 5 years, the pre-Girmitiyas accepted Fiji as the new homeland, leased land to farm, they settled in sugarcane areas, and the identity changed towards the peasantry-based Girmitiyas. So the original identity of the Indian, the Girmitiyas, which was in terms of place, caste, and religion at the time of migration, gradually shifted towards the group identity, which Brisdal said, Jahajis, that means sea-based brotherhood, during the long journey to Fiji. So then the Girmitiyas acquired a plantation identity and as a coolies, and subsequently changed to Fiji Indian identity, along with the identity of Indian ancestry. So after acquiring Fiji citizenship, they were designated as Fiji citizens, and they were variously called as Fiji One Indian, Indo-Fijian, and so on. So with the adoption of 2013 Fiji Constitution, as we know, that Fiji Indian has a now common Fijian citizenship. So these are the identity changes, and Girmitiyas overall, they formed the primary Indian diaspora rising from the misery, poverty, and exploitation as indentured laborers, and gradually transformed to an affluent community in Fiji. The indentured farm laborers supported their children to acquire better education and help them to move away from farming to non-farming employment. So they gradually transform themselves from the bonded agricultural laborers to small holding farmers, artisans, government officials, and so on. So the Girmit diaspora today in Fiji, as we see, which I have been working on, and some publication there, so gradually becoming, transmigrants, and that's everywhere, and creating a distinct diaspora of Fiji Indian descent in the transnational space. So let me quickly discuss the contemporary trends of Fiji Indian diaspora in making. As you know, over 100.
Dr. Mohanty, may I request you to please conclude because we are running really out of time.
Yes, I'm coming to in 2 minutes. I'll finish it up. 142 years of journey. The Girmitiyas and descendants have undergone massive social cultural transformation, making this Fiji Indian diaspora. So the primary Girmit diaspora, which used to be heterogeneous in nature, but the secondary Fiji Indian diaspora are very much homogeneous. But Girmit diasporic population is decreasing. As you know, it has come down from, it was 50% around 1966, but it has come down to 34%, and it is expected to decline further in future. And so Girmitiya diaspora population, the secondary migration, it's forming a Pacific Rim migrating due to the large-scale immigration. This has been going on. And as I estimated, around 170,000 or more Fiji Indian diaspora, the descendants of Fiji Girmit diaspora living in Australasia, USA, Canada, and the UK. So Australia is home to the largest Fiji Indian diaspora, accounting about 1/3 of the Fiji Indian global diasporic population. And they are also, as already referred earlier, and different names. In New Zealand, like Kiwi Fiji Indians, or Australia is Aussie Fiji Indian, respectively, they're called. So there has been thrice migration to other countries from the second homeland. So they are becoming Aussie Fijian Indian to the UK or USA, as Professor already mentioned. So there is the contemporary Fiji Indian has been creating a kind of Fiji Indian cultural field transnationally, and the common elements in this cultural bonding is Fiji Hindi, Raman Mandalis, Yangona, which is Kava, the local drink. So these are the three important elements in binding the Indo-Fijians or Fiji Indians transnationally. So to conclude, as you know, Girmit Indentured diaspora remain one of the oldest Indian diaspora, and the Indian immigration under British indentured labor system has contributed much to the formation of contemporary Indian diaspora globally. So the contemporary Indian diaspora is very complex today and very multidimensional with multiple identities. And Fiji Girmit diaspora accounting for less than 2% of the total persons of Indian origin made significant contribution into Fiji, making Fiji a modern and prosperous nation. And Fiji Girmit diaspora contribution have extended beyond Fiji and spreading transnationally. So today, the link between Fiji Girmit diaspora and India and their engagement is growing more than ever before. And it is, again, the great work done by the Indian High Commission here and the Director Santosh Mishra and so on. So as already Daljit Maharaj has pointed out, so it is likely to grow in the future. So what I conclude that India needs to engage more with the descendants of Fiji Girmit and Girmit diaspora in general, and design policies and strategies for their active engagement for the benefits of both India and Fiji. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mohanty, for a very insightful presentation. We are greatly thankful to all the three speakers, Ambassador Virendra Gupta, Professor Ruben, and Dr. Mohanty. In case anyone have some comments or questions, we can quickly take one or two questions because we are really running out of time. If anyone has some comment or question, please raise your hand. Okay, then we will move to the next session. Once again, I thank all the three speakers, Ambassador Virendra Gupta, Professor Ruben, and Dr. Manoranjan Mohanty for their insightful presentation. I now hand over the proceeding to my colleague, Dr. Shrishti Pokhrel, for the next session.
Thank you, Siddharth. Namaskar and good afternoon from India. We now move into the next session, which is Keeping Indian Culture Alive. It has been a very fascinating first half of the day. So as we proceed towards the second half of the conference, the next session is Keeping Indian Culture Alive. We have three marvelous speakers for this panel, Dr. Satish Rai, Mr. Selvanandan, and Dr. Sarita Bodu. To begin the session with, I would invite Dr. Satish Rai. Dr. Satish Rai is a Sydney-based academic. Is a film, TV producer, journalist, and community development worker. He's the director of Indian Diaspora Council Australia, Inc., and president of Global Girmit Association, Inc. Currently, he is completing his fifth book, which is really fascinating, Romancing with Cinema, and running revision dialogues Zoom sessions. So we are eagerly waiting to hear you. Dr. Satish Rai, over to you.
Hello, good evening from Sydney. Namaskar to everybody. So acknowledge a couple of people I recognize who are with us today. My younger brother, Ajay Chabra from London. Namaskar. And as you can see, Umesh Chandra as well from Brisbane. Can I share? I'm not very good. I've just started my Zoom dialogues. I'm not very good in sharing screens. I'll try. Can I?
There's a share screen option at the bottom of your screen.
Okay.
With green. You can click on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's now started. Yeah.
And Dr. Satish, you can offer the slideshow just to give a better view.
Sorry?
You can offer the slideshow if you're comfortable with it, or else we can go ahead with this too. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, yeah, I should be able to move here. Can I start off with, though I've been researching and working on Girmit for the last 30 years, keeping Indian culture alive is something which I have not really worked on much, and I have not written much on this aspect of Girmit history. But Shreya gave this topic for me to speak on, so I thought I will try my best. And so I prepared this slide, and hopefully I'll do some justice to this topic. Yes, as Srishti has mentioned, that I'm a filmmaker, now online journalist, historical researcher, writer, and community development professional. I'll briefly tell you about a bit more about my background and why I think I'm qualified to speak a bit about this topic. My grandparents and two uncles were born in Bharat. They were transported to Fiji around 1911. My parents were born in Fiji, and I was born in Fiji, and my grandchildren and my children were born in London. I'm one of the rare few who have traced the ancestral roots of all my 4 sets of grandparents back to Bharat. I visited 2 of my ancestral relatives in the villages of Balrampur and Lakhimpur Kheri. I'm yet to visit my Nani's father, who's from a village near Nagpur. And unfortunately, I don't think I'll be able to find my relatives of my Aja, who I think was from Ayodhya, but somehow his
ancestral past, the Girmit past says that he's from Basti, a village, visited the village in Basti, but I could not find the relatives there, and I don't think that he's from that village. Sometimes it happens that some wrong information is noted in the Girmit past. As I said, I've been researching Girmit since 1988. Rather, it should be 1988 when I started my sociology degree course. And because I was an anti-racist professional in London then, I decided to major in race. And I really wanted to find out what were the reasons of huge racial problem in London. And I like to get to the bottom of the root causes of any issue. So I researched extensively on Eurocentric racism, and that goes back to the African slavery, and which was followed by the Grimm system. And based on that research and my anti-racist work, I wrote my first book, Silent Cries, which was launched in 1995. And we put up a play by that name in 1995 as well. And I was very happy, and I'm still happy that my friend, my younger brother Ajay Chhabra, played the lead role in that play when it was featured in the Hounslow Asian Arts Festival. Then I went on to continue my research on Girmit in my MA thesis in 1997, and I followed that up with further research on Fiji Girmitiyas. It was called In Exile at Home, as part of my Doctor of Creative Arts degree, in which I proved that the Fiji Girmitiyas, majority of them were prevented from leaving Fiji, and thus they were exiled permanently in Fiji. I heard somebody say that they became citizens of Fiji once they were exiled there. That is not true. None of the Girmitiyas ever anywhere were ever citizens of their country. They always remained citizens of India until they died, because none of the countries, colonies where they were transported were independent at that time. And by the time they were independent, most of them had died. So they died as Indians. I've made 10 documentary films on Girmit, highlighting, tracing ancestral roots of Girmitiyas. In 2019, I made a feature-length film and 9 episodes TV series in India, narrating the twin stories of the exile of Lord Rama and the exile of global Girmitiyas that I did from locations, starting from Ayodhya, right down to Rameshwaram, and then in Dhanushkodi, where Ram Setu was built. As I mentioned, I've written a play, 4 books, and several articles on Girmit and Girmitiyas since 1994. Now, coming to the conference itself, its name changing identities, shifting trends and roles. I have written an article on that, but I'll save that for another time. But I firmly believe today that we can have multiple homes and multiple identities. And I have identified in the article the Janam Bhumi, and my Janam Bhumi is in Fiji. We cannot change that. And my Mathabhumi is Bharat. We cannot change that. But Karambhumi is change, which started off being in Fiji, then London. Now for last 22 years or so, it has been Australia, as well as India, where I do a lot of my filming. I like to end this section by saying that my ancestors permanently connect me to India now. And now to the topic which was given to me, keeping Indian culture alive. As I said, I didn't do much work in this respect, so I had to Google to find out what culture means. And simply, culture is the characteristics and knowledge of a particular group of people, encompassing language, religion, cuisine, social habits, music, and arts. Thus, it can be seen as the growth of a group identity fostered by social patterns and unique to the group. And Wikipedia defines it a bit further. I will start this section by saying that I'll keep my address today to the Fiji Girmit culture. And within that, as somebody just mentioned, that during that period, there were two groups of people, the Girmitiyas, who came under the agreement, who formed about majority of the Girmitiyas, Indo-Fijians. And then there were the people who travel as free passengers. They were mainly Gujaratis and Punjabis. And they came mainly as merchants or servants of the merchants. And so mainly in my talk today, I'm not going to include the culture of the Gujaratis in Fiji and the Punjabis, because I do not have much information on them. I would start by saying that the main credit for keeping the Indian culture in Fiji, also in the global Girmit diaspora, goes to the Girmitiyas. We all know that the Girmitiyas left their homeland Bharat with little other than the clothes on their bodies and the Indian culture in their hearts, minds, and souls. Despite the horrendous conditions they found themselves in, many thousands of miles away from their loved ones, they did not forsake their culture. Pandit Totaram Sanadhyay from Hirangao near Agra states in his book, Mere 21 Varsh Fiji Dweep Mein, that despite a lot of pressure being put on him to convert to Christianity, he did not. This is the truth. This is true for almost all the Girmitiyas of Fiji. Despite all the adversities and the Girmitiyas had to face in Fiji and other colonies, they ensured that they passed on their Indian culture to their children. And now I'll allude to the main ways in which they managed to keep their culture alive. The main one, I think somebody today has mentioned, that is language. I feel Girmitiyas of Fiji as well as Suriname have kept their language alive and well till today. There are certain former colonies, like in Caribbean, perhaps in Mauritius and South Africa, because due to the passage of time, the languages have been lost in the main. But I've been led to believe that as far as Mauritius is concerned, they are now getting back into Bhojpuri language. I say the language they spoke is the version or versions of Bhojpuri and Awadhi, which they had brought with them from India. What is notable is that within a very short time after arrival in Fiji and elsewhere, the South Indians, the Gujaratis and the Punjabis began to speak this language as well. In Fiji, this language, now mother tongue of the descendants of Girmites, is called Fiji Hindi or Fiji Bath. In Suriname and its diaspora, I think it is called Hindustani. This language plays a crucial role in keeping the Girmitiya culture alive in the Girmi diaspora. Regional languages such as Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam is not spoken so much, but play crucial roles in keeping alive the regional cultures and religious events, including weddings and funeral services. I'd like to say that it's a pity that these languages, especially in Fiji, I'm aware, have not been taken up so much. It had to give into the North Indian languages, but I think attempts are now being made to revive these languages, and that will be a good thing. Now coming to religion. Religion,
if I may interrupt, 5 minutes more, please, sir.
Okay, so I have to be very, very quick now.
Yes.
Yeah, religion has played a very important role as well in keeping the culture alive. And I'll just note that about 90% of the Girmitiyas were Hindus, and about 10% were Muslims. And that broadly reflected the composition of religion in India in that era, in that region as well. That is mainly UP and Bihar area. Then I'll come to folk songs. Recently, on behalf of the Global Girmit Association and Indian Diaspora Council of Australia, I've launched a Reimagining Global Girmit History, narrating the voices of the India project. And in that project, we are trying to find an alternative voice for the Girmitiyas as opposed to the colonized narrative, which is predominant today. And in that, we are emphasizing the folk songs like Bidesiyas, Biras, Sohars, weddings, and bhajans and kirtans. We'll be looking at them, we'll be dissecting them, and we'll try to find out the voices of Girmitiyas in those folk songs. And I think we'll be able to get some very amazing knowledge from these folk songs. And now coming to the roles of festivals, weddings, and religious ceremonies. Both the Hindu and Muslim Girmitiyas had taken with them their respective festivals, wedding rituals, and many other ceremonies. And also festivals like Holi, Fagua, Diwali, Eid, Ram Navami, Krishna Janmashtami, they play a crucial role in keeping the culture alive. And the ceremonies include Satnarayan Katha, Havan, Ramayana, Gita recitals, and things like that. I will be ending shortly. I want to emphasize the role of Ramayana. Somebody else has mentioned that Ramayana and Ramayana Mandalis and Ramlila Kutis have played a crucial role in keeping the culture alive in Fiji and elsewhere as well. Much emphasize that the exile of Lord Ram had played a crucial role in the survival of the Girmitiyas, not just in Fiji, but elsewhere as well. And recently, my team and I were in India. We made a film and TV series called Lord Rama in Exile, an epic journey of survival of global Girmitiyas, in which I've narrated the twin story of the exile of Lord Rama and the exile of global Girmitiyas and how it was important. And just finishing off with Indian cuisine, food defines a community very well. And the Girmitiyas has taken their food with them. And still today, they play a very important role in the lives of the Girmitiyas and the descendants. Must say, we still find, in every Hindu wedding, the pumpkin curry and the roti and the dal puri, and in Muslim wedding, you'll find the pilau, which we love to go to, when we were young back home in Fiji. And with the role of Hindi radio, newspaper, books, magazines, and films, they all played very, very important role in keeping the language alive and also connecting the Girmitiyas in the diaspora with India, giving glimpses of these scenes of India. Yes, we don't have much time. I'm aware of that. Just mentioning the headlines, the also role of Indian schools or religious centers and community centers, they all played very important role. In conclusion, I'd just like to finish up saying that, as I said before, that this topic was given to me. I did research on this, and a lot of it was from my recollection of living in Fiji for first 24 years of my life, and then going back lecturing in Fiji in 2009 to 2012. And I feel a lot more research needs to be done on this subject, not only in Fiji, but in all the former colonies, pyramid colonies, as well as in the diaspora, extended diaspora today. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Satish Rai. You did say that it's not the subject or it's not the topic which you are an expert on, but after hearing you, I mean, I'm sure that everyone has a different opinion that you have touched all the aspects of keeping Indian culture alive, and that definitely it's your experiences, your work, which itself speaks for keeping the culture alive. Moving on to the next speaker, we have Mr. Selvanandan. He's the Secretary of Fiji Girmit Council. Professionally, Mr. Nandan is a consultant in customs and trade, but he is also actively working for a number of NGOs such as Fiji Girmit Council, Golden Age Home, Western Association for Persons with Disabilities, and TISI Sangam as part of his voluntary service to the communities. It's indeed a pleasure to have you for this session. Over to you, Mr. Selvanandan.
Thank you, Madam MC. Are you able to hear me?
Able to hear you.
Thank you. It's almost 8 p.m. on a Friday in Fiji, so my warm greetings and a very good evening to all my fellow participants and speakers. Before I deliver my short presentation today, I wish to take this opportunity to express my sincere gratitude to the organizers for extending me this opportunity to participate in this forum and to share my views and perspectives on this very important topic. Like the previous speaker, Dr. Satish Rai, I would not claim to be an expert in this field, but nonetheless, I'll try my best to do justice for being given this opportunity to speak. So the key focus of my presentation today will be what the Fiji Girmit Cultural Center is doing to preserve and promote our culture and tradition in Fiji. Just in terms of a short background, the Fiji Girmit Multicultural Center was established in 1980 as a monument to commemorate the arrival of the indentured laborers from India to Fiji. I think previous speakers have spoken on this at length, so I'm not going to duplicate what they have said. But it should be noted that they have made tremendous sacrifice to build schools, temples, and other religious places for the education and spiritual development of the descendants who chose to stay back and live in Fiji or call Fiji their home. Although most of them were illiterate, but they had the foresight and vision for the needs of the future generation. And for that, they must be commended. They left behind a legacy for the future generation for which we will forever remain indebted to them. Our culture, therefore, has a strong link with our history and heritage. In this regard, it is important that the Girmit Center remain relevant and responsive to the evolving needs of our members for the maintenance of our tradition and culture. This is the only way we can ensure the continued maintenance of our strong tradition, culture, customs, hopes, and aspirations of the descendants of Girmitiyas in Fiji. Over the years, in its quest to promote and preserve culture, music, arts, and language, the center has been providing training at nominal cost to the students of Lautoka. The courses were first introduced by the ICCR division of the High Commission of India in 2010. However, a change in policy in 2014 led to the withdrawal of the funding and other support for the center. But the Girmit Council management decided to continue running the center, as closing the programs would have been detrimental in the greater interest of the students because they had already completed half of the program. While some funding assistance was provided by the High Commission later on a temporary period, it was again suspended in 2020 due to COVID-19 pandemic. Now, as a small NGO with limited resources and with no external funding, we are currently struggling to maintain our services. To put it in another way, we are punching much above our weight. Today, with the role of 140 students enrolled in various programs, we are the largest cultural center in Fiji, offering Bharatanatyam, vocal harmonium, tabla, guitar, and Hindi language and yoga classes in Fiji. Unfortunately, the modest tuition fees paid by the students are not sufficient to cover the cost of running the center. Some of them come from very poor families who are unable to afford the fees. So we have to end up giving them scholarships. We have made several requests to the Office of the High Commission of India and Fiji for more musical instruments, accessories, and costumes, but despite assurances, no assistance had been provided as of to date. As part of our cultural outreach programs, the students also participate in events at schools, temples, shows, annual conventions, in addition to the performing in the Girmit Center organized programs and events, and also festivals like Girmit Divas, Diwali, Holi, etc., where they normally perform dramas, songs, and dance items. It is encouraging to witness a shift in trend as testified that by the threefold growth in student numbers over the last 3 years. It's a testament of the realization among the parents on the importance of inculcating good culture and basic human values into their children for the character development and turning them into law-abiding citizens. We strongly believe that not only manners, but culture also maketh men. We have observed a dramatic behavioral change in our students in terms of their attitude and respect for their parents and elders in the community. Yes, we want to do much more, and we can do more if we strengthen our institutional capacity. Now I want to take a few minutes of our time to talk about some of the key challenges that we are currently facing. Like all other organizations, we also have our own share of challenges and issues to deal with, which to a large extent has been compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic. Please allow me to elaborate on this. Number one, due to lack of external funding support, the center has been operating on a deficit budget for the last five years. The revenue from whole hire, which is our main source of income, used to cushion the shortfall, has also been lost due to current restrictions on social gatherings. On the other hand, if we increase the fees, then it will become unaffordable for the poor students, forcing them to drop out. And that's the last thing we want to happen. Some parents have lost their jobs or are on reduced pay at the moment. That's the dilemma we are currently facing. Because of the financial constraints, it is becoming difficult to sustain our operations. The second issue is that given our space limitation, we're unable to accommodate all the new intakes that we get every year. Sometimes we have to run classes in parallel, which is not conducive for learning. As a result, we have to divide the students into different groups, which cost us more in terms of teachers' allowance. So we need a bigger size hall to meet the growing demand of our students. The other issue is we have been facing the shortage of instrument and accessories, as I have highlighted earlier. And some of the items over the years, because the children are new, they learn how to play, and they sort of damage some of the items, and these items need to be replaced over a period of time. So several requests have been made, as I said, but we try to do some fundraising here and now and then to try to keep replacing some damaged instrument that we need to do. But as I said, because the student number is going up every year, we need more and more accessories and instruments. Now, the other issue is the shortage of trained teachers in Fiji. For example, we have only one qualified and accredited Bharatanatyam dance teacher in the West. When I'm talking about West, Dr. Rai will know, I'm talking about the western part of the mainland. And we are worried that in the event she decides to move on, she's single at the moment, she might have some other future plans. And if she decides to move on or migrate, then we'll be completely stranded because we have no other trained person in the West who can take over her place. So there is an urgent need to develop a pool of teachers to fill the gap. The next one is under the new social distancing rules, the emergence of coronavirus. Following the emergence of coronavirus, we have been operating on ad hoc basis whereby classes were suspended for a few months. Now, in a bid to retain the interest, we are offering online classes for some of our programs. However, some of the learnings such as dance and music are more effective in groups. The other problem is access to internet, which many parents are finding hard to afford. We are afraid that the long break will have a negative impact on the students, which will diminish the interest level. Some of them have forgotten what they have learned so far and would need to start all over again once we resume our face-to-face classes in the future. The last issue that I want to talk about is the growing addiction amongst children to social media as a result of the confinement at home during this COVID crisis. This is also proving to a major issue. Since the schools are closed, the children are spending more time on the smartphones, watching movies or chatting with friends, while the parents are away at work. This is another major distraction and impediment that we have to grapple with. So I don't want to take much more time. I think I'll conclude my short presentation there. And thank you all for listening. And I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Selvanandan. It was indeed enlightening to hear about your work, the organization's work. It has been tough times for everyone during the pandemic, and what your council, your organization has been doing is indeed commendable. And thank you for sharing your work and experience with it. Now we go to the third speaker for the session, Dr. Sarita Budu. Dr. Sarita Budu is the chairperson of Bhojpuri Speaking Union under the aegis of the Ministry of Arts and Cultural Heritage. She has also set up the Mauritius Bhojpuri Institute in 1982. She holds a BA Honours degree in Geography from Lady Brabourne College, Calcutta University. She also has a PhD in Hindi from Varanasi and Diploma in Advanced Journalism from Germany and France. She is a social activist, a writer, and journalist, and is very well versed in Indology and Indian diasporic studies. Over to you, ma'am. If you could please unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. We can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay. Salute to everybody. Namaskar to all our Girmitiya brothers and sisters from all over the world whom we have met sometimes. The topic of this conference, changing identities, shifting trends and roles, is very fitting for this present generation. Let me begin with a song which our forefather, our Girmitiya Dadi Nani sang, and which we have reconstructed for our Mauritius Bhojpuri Institute ballet. Kalakata se chhutal jahaj panwariya dheere chalo ume aa gail ba dada hamar ho ume aa gail ba dadi hamar panwariya dheere chalo ume aa gail ba Ramayan hamar ho ume aa gail ba Puran hamar, ume aa gail ba Gita hamar, oh, ume aa gail ba Quran hamar, panwariya dheere chalo, ume aa gail ba Sari hamar ho, ume aa gail ba फूली हमार उमे आगल बाधोती हमार हो उमे आगल बाहरवा हमार कंवरिया धीरे चलो कलकत्ता से छूटल जहाज कंवरिया धीरे चलो. Allow me first of all to say how delighted I am to participate in this wonderful conference on Girmitiya hosted by the India Foundation of New Delhi. I should like in particular to thank Shreya ji for having established the base and connectivity for this conference, as well as Srimati Sunita Pahuja, the second secretary of the Indian High Commission in Mauritius, who has coaxed me to participate in the webinar. Thank you so much for giving me this chance. It is indeed commendable that lately there has been more awareness created around the saga of the Girmitiyas as an aspect of Indian migratory process. Culture is a process of the way of life, and it is a dynamic natural change that is hardly noticed. It is not a static thing that you can freeze or preserve. Culture evolves. But the Indian culture, being a very vast area of knowledge, skills, art forms, has transcended time and space since the beginning of civilization. The essence of the Indian civilizational ethos has been transmitted throughout millennia from generation to generation around the theme of unity in diversity. And wherever the Indian has gone, Sat Samundar Par or